close your eyes and picture a small Tuscan village at dusk, the year somewhere in the middle of the 15th century. A boy walks along a dusty path, his hands stained with charcoal, his eyes lingering on the flight of birds overhead. You know his name already, Leonardo, but here is the quiet twist. Before he became the figure the world remembers, he was simply a curious child in the countryside, more interested in how water moved through streams, or how shadows slid across stone walls, than in fame or fortune. To him, each leaf, each ripple, each wingbeat seemed alive with secret knowledge waiting to be sketched. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how that simple habit, pausing to notice what others passed by, was the beginning of a life that would stretch across painting, engineering, anatomy, and dreams of flight. Breathe slowly and imagine the rustle of his pages, the faint scratching of quill on parchment, the candlelight pooling over drawings of gears, faces, and rivers, all side by side. He never saw his mind as divided. To Leonardo, everything connected. And now, with the lamp turned a little lower, we'll step softly into chapter 1, where his early days in Vinci will open before us like a quiet sketch brought to life. In the gentle hills of Tuscany, where olive groves rolled like waves and vineyards caught the sunlight in rows of green and gold, a child named Leonardo first opened his eyes to the world. And though history remembers him as a painter, inventor, engineer, and dreamer, in those early years he was simply a boy of Vinci, a small village surrounded by the hush of fields and the murmur of streams. And as you breathe slowly, picture him wandering barefoot along dusty paths, a stick in his hand, tracing patterns in the soil, his eyes forever pulled upward to the clouds, downward to the grass, outward to the folds of the land itself, for he carried within him a gaze that never ceased to wander. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice that Vinci was no grand city like Florence or Milan, but a quiet place, its stone houses clustered on a hill, its people tending to olives, figs, and grapes, their days measured by bells and by seasons. And yet within this simplicity the seeds of genius were nourished. For Leonardo grew not among crowds and noise, but among the soft rhythms of nature, and every breath of wind through the cypress trees, every ripple on the surface of a pond, every wing of a sparrow in flight left a trace on his memory as clearly as any lesson in a book. And as you breathe again, imagine him kneeling beside a stream, his small fingers breaking apart reeds, setting them afloat, watching how the water carried them away, tilting them this way and that. The boy already seeing what most did not, that water had laws, patterns, secret movements that could be drawn, measured, understood, if only one cared enough to look. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how this early habit of looking deeply at ordinary things became his lifelong gift, the quiet engine of his art and his science alike. For while other children may have seen only chores or play, Leonardo found mysteries: why the sky glowed pink at dusk, why shadows bent at certain angles, why birds arched their wings just so before gliding to earth. Breathe gently and picture the small home he shared with his family, its walls simple, its hearth warm, its table filled with bread, cheese, and olives, the air carrying the scent of wood smoke. And picture the boy sitting by the fire in the evenings, a piece of charcoal in hand, sketching on scraps of paper or the margins of an old book, lines looping and curling into faces, plants, and animals. And though no one yet thought of him as extraordinary, those first drawings were the beginning of a hand that would one day shape the most famous smile in history. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice that Leonardo was born out of wedlock, a circumstance that might have limited another. But for him it meant freedom, not pressed into the strict paths of law or clergy. He drifted instead toward observation, toward craft, toward the workshops where artisans shaped wood, metal, and pigment. And his early years were not bound by duty so much as by possibility. And as you breathe again, imagine the Tuscan countryside itself as his first teacher, the soft hum of bees in fields of lavender, the flash of fish in a stream, the turning of mill wheels along the Arno River, the way hills folded one into another like layers of fabric, and in this landscape he learned to see patterns, connections, rhythms, until the world itself became his school. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how his grandfather, Antonio, and his uncle, Francesco, nurtured him in quiet ways, allowing his wanderings, tolerating his constant questions, and perhaps smiling when he returned home with pockets full of stones, feathers, and shells, treasures not for play but for study. For already he saw in each object a story, the spiral in a shell hinting at geometry, the shimmer of a feather hinting at flight, the shape of a pebble hinting at rivers long gone. Breathe softly and picture the church of Vinci, its bells tolling across the valley, its frescoes faintly colored by light, and imagine young Leonardo staring at those images, not with the devotion expected of a child, but with the curiosity of an apprentice, wondering how pigments clung to plaster, how the figures seemed to move within their frames, how light made colors glow. And already his eyes were learning lessons that no master yet had taught him. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how much of his early genius was solitude, hours spent alone with the land, sketching shadows cast by leaves, chasing the motion of insects, digging into the earth to examine roots, and though others may have thought him distracted or dreamy, he was, in truth, practicing the art of seeing, of holding the world still long enough to draw out its secrets. And as you breathe again, think of him in springtime, climbing a hill until the village lay far below, lying on his back in the grass, clouds drifting overhead. And in their shapes he found both wonder and instruction, sketching their curls and swells, already sensing that even vapor obeyed unseen laws, already wondering how one might capture in pigment the endless change of sky. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how this boy of Vinci would soon move to Florence, the city of marble churches and bustling workshops. But before that great step, his early life was one of quiet gathering, of filling his mind and heart with images and questions that would serve him for all his years. And as the lamp burns lower in our story, imagine Leonardo as a child returning home at dusk, the horizon glowing, his sketches tucked under his arm, the air cool on his face, and though no one yet knew, within him was already the gentle fire that would one day light not only canvases but also inventions, notebooks, and dreams that reached far beyond his time. And with that vision of young Leonardo walking softly through the Tuscan twilight, we prepare to step gently into the next chapter, where the streets of Florence will open before him and his apprenticeship will begin. The boy of Vinci carrying his wonder into the city that would shape his destiny. When Leonardo left the quiet hills of Vinci for Florence, it was as though a stream had flowed into a great river. For Florence was no small village of olive groves and streams, but the beating heart of Renaissance art and craft, its streets alive with the sounds of hammers shaping marble, of merchants calling from stalls, of bells ringing from churches. and of voices echoing in courtyards where ideas themselves seem to spark and rise into the air. And as you breathe slowly, picture the young Leonardo, barely more than a boy, stepping into this world of bustle, his wide eyes drinking in every detail, from the silken garments of nobles brushing past him to the smell of wet stone after rain, to the way sunlight spilled over the great dome of Santa Maria del Fiore. Brunelleschi's marvel that stood above the city like a promise that human hands could touch the heavens. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice that Florence was not only a place of beauty, but also of opportunity, where masters took on apprentices to learn the crafts of painting, sculpture, metalwork, and architecture, and Leonardo, with his natural gift for drawing, soon entered the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio, a man both sculptor and painter, who held within his studio a hive of young talents, each laboring at panels and statues, grinding pigments, stretching canvases, and breathing in the dust and fragrance of creation. Imagine for a moment the space, wooden beams overhead darkened by smoke, windows high and narrow letting in angled shafts of light, the scent of linseed oil, of melted wax, of fresh plaster, and the gentle scrape of tools against stone, all mingling into a symphony of work. And in this atmosphere Leonardo thrived, his curiosity finding new fuel with every task assigned. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how an apprentice's day was not filled with grand inventions or famous works, but with humble duties, mixing colors from minerals and plants, preparing brushes, cleaning tools, learning the precise strokes to draw drapery or the correct shading to make a cheek seem round. And Leonardo performed these tasks with patience, but also with a hunger to know why shadows curved, why fabrics folded, why faces revealed so much with the tilt of an eye. And as you breathe again, picture him standing at a panel, assigned to paint angels or background figures, his hand steady, his imagination restless. For even when instructed to follow tradition, he would sometimes add a softness to a smile, a glow to the skin, a movement to the hair that made his figures seem alive in ways others could not quite match. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how Verrocchio's workshop became a place where Leonardo's genius first shimmered into view. For when the master painted the baptism of Christ and asked his apprentice to contribute, Leonardo painted an angel at the edge of the scene, and when it was done, the figure seemed to breathe, its face tender, its expression serene. And some say that Verrocchio, upon seeing it, realized his pupil had surpassed him, though whether that story is true or not, it reveals how even then Leonardo's hand carried something rare. And as you breathe softly, imagine him at night after the workshop closed, wandering the streets of Florence, pausing by the Arno River, watching how lanterns flickered on the water, how bridges arched like the backs of sleeping animals, how towers loomed against the stars. And in each sight he found not only beauty but lessons, reflections that taught him about optics, arches that taught him about engineering, stars that stirred his questions about the heavens. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice that Florence itself was a classroom, its guilds and markets filled with artisans demonstrating skills, its libraries holding manuscripts on geometry, medicine, and philosophy, its churches filled with frescoes and sculptures that turned walls and stone into stories. And Leonardo absorbed it all, not as a student following a single path, but as a wanderer collecting every detail, convinced that all knowledge was connected. And as you breathe again, imagine him in Verrocchio's studio sketching a horse. its muscles straining, its mane whipping, and then later sketching a machine of wheels and pulleys, and then later sketching a face with eyes half closed in thought. And though these seemed unrelated to Leonardo, they were threads of the same fabric. For he believed nature itself was a grand design, and to understand one part was to understand the whole. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll see how his perfectionism began to shape him, how he would linger over a drawing, adjusting and adjusting, unwilling to leave a line until it felt alive. How he would start projects with great energy yet sometimes leave them unfinished, not from laziness, but from a restless spirit always chasing a deeper truth. And though this trait would follow him throughout his life, it also gave his finished works their singular depth, for he would not settle for the ordinary. And as you breathe softly, imagine him among his fellow apprentices, some content to copy the master's ways, others eager for commissions, but Leonardo, quiet, thoughtful, often drifting to the edges of the group, studying the play of light across a face or the movement of water in a basin. And in these quiet studies, he was already preparing for a future in which his art would be unlike any other. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice how Florence itself, under the rule of the Medici family, was a place of ferment, where poets recited verses in courtyards, where philosophers debated in cloisters, where architects competed to raise new wonders of stone. And young Leonardo, though still unknown, breathed this atmosphere of ambition and possibility, carrying it into his sketches, his notebooks, his dreams. And as you breathe again, picture him in springtime walking along the marketplace, stalls overflowing with spices, fabrics, and books, the air rich with the scent of leather and fruit, his hands itching to sketch everything he saw. And perhaps you can feel the soft flutter of his pages as he drew, each line a practice, each curve a promise. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll see how the boy from Vinci had now become a young man of Florence, his talent already whispered about, his eye already searching beyond what tradition taught. And though his fame was not yet fixed, the path was opening before him, one brushstroke at a time. And as the lamp lowers in our telling, imagine him once more at the end of a day, the workshop silent, a candle burning beside his papers, his quill scratching as he wrote backwards in his mirrored script, filling pages with sketches of machines, faces, and plants, secrets that few would read in his own lifetime, yet treasures for those to come. And with that image of Leonardo, quietly at work while the city slept, we prepare to step gently into the next chapter, where commissions will call, and the young apprentice will begin to emerge as a master in his own right, carrying forward the light of curiosity that began in Vinci and now burned brighter in Florence. Leonardo's years as an apprentice had ripened his skills until the time came when Florence began to see him not just as a helper in Verrocchio's workshop, but as a painter in his own right. And though he still moved in the shadows of greater masters, his name began to whisper its way through the streets, through the squares where patrons looked for talent to adorn their chapels and palaces, and through the conversations of guilds who oversaw commissions. For in him they sensed a rare spark, and as you breathe slowly, picture Leonardo standing at his easel, the air warm, the scent of oil and resin mixing with dust, his hand steady as he worked on his first independent paintings, each one filled with details that seemed almost too alive to belong to pigment alone. His angels and Madonnas gazing not as stiff symbols, but as gentle presences, their lips soft with unspoken words, their eyes filled with a depth that invited you to linger. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice that Leonardo's early works, though few survive, already carried hints of what would make him unique, a delicate blending of light and shadow. What later would be called sfumato, that soft, hazy transition which made a cheek glow and a smile hover between mystery and reality. And when others painted outlines sharp and clear, Leonardo blurred them just enough that the figure seemed part of the air itself, as though breathing the same breath as the viewer. And as you breathe again, imagine him at work on the Annunciation, the angel kneeling before Mary in a garden that stretches beyond into cypress and mountains, the wings painted with the careful observation of a boy who had once watched birds in the hills of Vinci, feathers layered one upon another with natural precision. And though some might have argued that the proportions or gestures were unusual, there was already a freshness, a quiet daring, that made the painting not a repetition of tradition, but a vision uniquely his own. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how Leonardo, still young, carried both promise and uncertainty. For though patrons praised his gift, he often left works unfinished, restless to move from one idea to another, his notebooks filling with sketches of inventions, of anatomy, of landscapes, even as commissions waited on his easel. And this tension between perfection and incompletion would become a defining rhythm of his life. And as you breathe softly, picture him beginning the adoration of the Magi, a grand commission meant for the monks of Saint Denis, a swirling scene of figures and horses, of architecture half-built and half-ruined, the central Madonna serene amid the chaos. And though Leonardo sketched it with brilliance, layering gesture upon gesture, movement upon movement, he never carried it to full color, leaving behind a monochrome work that to this day feels like a dream suspended, a glimpse into his mind more than a finished painting for the church. And yet in that unfinished state we see his genius more clearly, for he was not only painting a holy scene, but meditating on human wonder, confusion, devotion, and awe. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice how Florence, though proud of her artists, was also a place of competition, with masters like Botticelli and Ghirlandaio commanding attention. And Leonardo, though brilliant, sometimes struggled to secure steady commissions, his perfectionism and wanderings making patrons uncertain. And yet the city could not quite let him go, for his work carried something no one else could match. And as you breathe again, imagine him spending long afternoons by the Arno, sketching the play of water around rocks, or dissecting the flight of a bird, or studying the geometry of leaves, all while a painting waited in his studio. And though to some he seemed distracted, to Leonardo this was the very core of creation, to look deeper, to gather the truths of nature, and then to return to the canvas with knowledge no other hand possessed. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how his notebooks, already filling with mirrored writing, held ideas far beyond his time. Machines that might fly, bridges that could be raised, canals that might redirect rivers. And though these were not commissions, they were the overflow of his restless genius, the sketches of a man whose mind refused boundaries. And as you breathe softly, think of him walking through the cloisters of Florence, hearing monks chant, seeing frescoes by older masters, and quietly imagining how he might paint differently, how he might make light itself part of the story, how he might soften a line until it seemed to vibrate with life. And already he was preparing for the works that would later astonish the world. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice how even in portraiture, Leonardo broke from convention, painting faces not as stiff emblems, but as individuals caught in living moments. And though his early portraits are fewer, they already hint at the quiet power that would one day make the Mona Lisa more than a likeness, but a mystery in paint. And as you breathe again, picture the young master at a Florentine gathering, where music played and poets recited verses, where patrons looked upon paintings and sculptures, and Leonardo, though not loud in conversation, let his work speak, his sketches passed hand to hand, his designs admired, his presence noted, until he became part of the city's living fabric of art and intellect. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll see how the boy from Vinci, once sketching reeds by a stream, now stood among Florence's finest. His journey still uncertain, but his gift undeniable. And though he would soon leave for other courts, seeking patronage beyond the city's walls, the roots of his art had sunk deep in Florence, where he learned not only to paint with beauty, but to think with breadth, to see the world as a great book waiting to be read. And as the lamp in our story lowers, imagine Leonardo late at night in his studio, a single candle burning, the city quiet outside, his hand moving over a panel, his thoughts wandering toward inventions, his quill scribbling notes in the margins. And though his works might remain unfinished, though his patrons might sometimes sigh at his delays, within him was already the greatness that no time, no doubt, no incompletion could diminish. And with that image of Leonardo, poised at the edge of mastery yet still restless, we step gently into the next chapter, where the courts of powerful patrons will beckon, and his journey will carry him beyond Florence, into the wider stage of Italy and into the unfolding story of the Renaissance itself. As Leonardo's reputation grew in Florence, admired for the tenderness of his brush and the restless brilliance of his mind, there came a time when his path began to stretch beyond the city's familiar stone walls. For Florence, though vibrant, was not always a place where his unfinished projects and unusual ideas found steady support. And so he began to look outward, toward the courts of princes and dukes, where powerful patrons sought artists not only for paintings but for engineering, for spectacle, for designs of war and of wonder. And as you breathe slowly, picture Leonardo gathering his sketches, his notebooks bound in rough leather, his brushes wrapped in cloth, preparing to leave behind the bustling workshops of his youth for the broader, more uncertain roads of Italy. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice that this departure was not a rejection of Florence, but a continuation of his restless search. For Florence had given him the foundation of skill, but now he hungered for challenges that matched the full range of his curiosity. And so, around the year 1482, he set his sights on Milan, ruled by Ludovico, a duke whose court was known for both power and extravagance, a place where art and engineering intertwined with politics, and where Leonardo believed his talents could unfold in new directions. And as you breathe again, imagine the journey north, the Tuscan hills fading into the distance, the roads winding through valleys, the sound of hooves and wheels echoing, and Leonardo riding quietly, carrying not only brushes but also dreams of machines, bridges, fortifications, and perhaps, above all, dreams of patronage that would let him explore without restraint. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how extraordinary his introduction to Milan was. For Leonardo did not simply present himself as a painter, but composed a letter to Ludovico Sforza, listing his skills as an engineer, offering designs for bridges, tunnels, cannons, armored vehicles, and devices for war. promising that in time of peace he could also create sculptures, paintings, and architecture. And though we remember him for his art, in that moment he sought recognition for his mechanical genius, revealing just how boundless his vision was. And as you breathe softly, picture Ludovico receiving this letter, intrigued by the audacity of the Florentine, perhaps amused, perhaps impressed. And soon Leonardo found himself welcomed at the Sforza court, a place of silk and steel, where courtiers in fine garments mingled with soldiers in armor, where banquets overflowed with music and conversation, where alliances were made and broken with the stroke of a pen. And in the midst of this, Leonardo, quiet, observant, took his place. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice that in Milan, Leonardo's work began to expand beyond canvas. For Ludovico employed him for many tasks, designing festival decorations, planning parades with mechanical devices, creating stage sets that dazzled with moving parts, even proposing grand projects of architecture and hydraulics. And in all of these, Leonardo's imagination found fertile ground. For here was a patron who valued spectacle as much as substance. And as you breathe again, imagine Leonardo sketching designs for machines of war giant crossbows, armored chariots, spiraled cannon barrels, his hand moving quickly, though whether these designs were ever built is uncertain. For, in truth, Leonardo may have intended them as demonstrations of possibility more than tools of destruction. For he, who loved the flight of birds and the flow of rivers, carried within him a contradiction, designing for war while dreaming of peace. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll see how amid these duties, Leonardo was also commissioned for a task that became one of his greatest obsessions, a colossal equestrian statue to honor Ludovico's father, Francesco Sforza, a horse so immense that it would dwarf all others, cast in bronze, and Leonardo threw himself into its study, dissecting horses to understand their muscles, sketching them in motion, designing molds and casting methods. And for years he pursued this dream, producing a clay model of astonishing size, so lifelike that those who saw it were awed. And yet fate intervened, for war came to Milan. Bronze was needed for cannons, and the horse was never completed, leaving behind only the memory of what might have been. And Leonardo, though disappointed, carried forward, his notebooks filled with equine studies that would later inspire artists for generations. And as you breathe softly, picture him in his Milanese studio, candlelight flickering across walls covered in sketches of machines, of anatomy, of architecture, his apprentices working around him, grinding pigments, mixing colors, stretching canvases, while Leonardo moved from one project to another, sometimes painting, sometimes dissecting, sometimes designing, his mind always leaping ahead. And though some patrons might have grown impatient, Ludovico seemed willing to indulge him, fascinated by the endless creativity that poured from his hands. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice that it was in Milan that Leonardo began work on one of his most famous masterpieces, The Last Supper, painted on the wall of the convent of Santa Maria del Grazie, a commission that would occupy him for years and test both his skill and his patience. For instead of using the tried and true fresco method, he experimented with oils and tempera on plaster, seeking richer tones and subtler shadows. And though the technique would cause the painting to deteriorate quickly, in the moment of its creation it was a marvel, the figures alive with emotion, each apostle reacting to Christ's words in a unique gesture, the scene filled with movement and silence at once. And as you breathe again, imagine Leonardo standing before the wall, brush in hand, pausing for long stretches, thinking, adjusting, returning with a few strokes that transformed a figure. And though monks and patrons grew restless at his slowness, Leonardo insisted on perfection, for he wished not to paint symbols but souls, to show not only faces but inner lives, and in this he succeeded, creating an image that to this day draws countless eyes. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how Milan offered Leonardo more than commissions. It offered friendships and connections, such as his companionship with musicians, with mathematicians, with thinkers who shared his curiosity. And it was here that he designed instruments, experimented with acoustics, studied proportion in music as in architecture, convinced that harmony ran through all things. And as you breathe softly, think of him walking through Milan at dusk, the streets alive with vendors, the towers silhouetted against a fading sky, his mind full of projects half finished and ideas just forming. And though he was now far from Vinci and Florence, he carried with him always that same boyish wonder that had once watched water carry reeds downstream. The same curiosity now turned toward the greatest projects of the Renaissance. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice that Leonardo's years in Milan, though fruitful, were also fragile, for politics shifted, enemies gathered, and Ludovico's fortunes would eventually fall. Yet even as the court trembled, Leonardo's work endured, his notebooks swelling with visions, his paintings glowing with light, his designs promising futures not yet ready to arrive. And as the lamp of our story lowers for tonight's telling, picture Leonardo in his Milanese chamber, setting down his brush after a long day, stretching his hands, leaning over his pages to add another sketch of a bird in flight or a machine with turning gears. The city quiet beyond his window, and though wars loomed, though patrons might change, within him the fire of curiosity burned steady, carrying him forward into new chapters, new cities, new creations. And with that image we step softly into the next part of his journey, where the successes of Milan and the disappointments alike would lead him onward, ever searching, ever sketching, ever dreaming, as the Renaissance itself unfolded around him. When Leonardo accepted the commission to paint the Last Supper for the Dominican convent of Santa Maria del Grazie in Milan, he knew he was facing not only a religious subject familiar to countless artists before him, but also an opportunity to attempt something entirely new, something that would combine his lifelong study of human gesture, emotion, and light into a single vision. And as you breathe slowly, imagine him stepping into the refectory, the dining hall where monks gathered each day for their meals, the walls plain, the air cool, the long tables echoing with the scrape of bowls, and at one end, a vast expanse of plaster waiting to be transformed into the most famous meal in history. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice that Leonardo, unlike other painters, did not rush, for he believed that each figure, each expression, must emerge only when he understood it fully, and so he spent long hours walking the streets of Milan, studying faces, noting the tilt of a brow, the curl of a lip, the flicker of eyes when words startled or saddened, and he filled his notebooks with sketches of men and women caught in unguarded moments, later to be woven into apostles caught at the instant when Christ announces, "One of you will betray me." And as you breathe again, picture the arrangement he chose, for instead of scattering the figures or making them static, he gathered them into groups of 3, each cluster alive with its own drama, hands reaching, faces turning. A conversation frozen in paint, yet trembling with life. And at the center, Christ, calm and resigned, forming a still point in the storm of reaction. His figure framed by the open window behind him. The light falling gently, as though heaven itself was present in the room. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how Leonardo's technique itself was daring. For instead of true fresco, which required painting swiftly on wet plaster, he experimented with tempera and oil on dry wall, hoping for greater subtlety of shading. And while this choice would later cause the work to deteriorate quickly, in its first days it glowed with a depth unlike anything seen before, colors softly merging, shadows melting into light, creating an atmosphere both real and otherworldly. And as you breathe softly, imagine him on his scaffold, brush in hand, sometimes pausing for hours without a stroke, lost in thought, while the friars below wondered if he had abandoned the task. Yet suddenly, after long silence, he would move again, adding just a few lines that transformed a figure entirely. For Leonardo worked not by habit, but by vision, seeking always the perfect balance of form and feeling. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice how even Judas, often painted as monstrous, was here given depth, recoiling, clutching the purse of silver, his face shadowed but still human. For Leonardo believed betrayal was not the act of demons but of men, frail and real, and in this he gave the story a truth that startled those who saw it. And as you breathe again, imagine the monks at their meals, raising their heads to see Christ and his disciples sharing bread on the wall above them. The room filled not with painted figures, but with presences, companions at the table, their gestures so vivid that one might expect them to move or speak. And in this way, Leonardo changed not only the painting but the very experience of the room, merging art with life. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how his perfectionism stretched the project over years, to the frustration of his patrons, yet the result justified the wait. For when it was finished, word of its beauty spread quickly, travelers coming to see the marvel, to stand before the wall and feel the quiet power of a scene both familiar and transformed. And as you breathe softly, think also of the fragility of the work, for the experimental technique meant that even within his lifetime it began to flake and fade, patches falling away, leaving monks and admirers alike distressed. And Leonardo himself, though saddened, perhaps accepted that impermanence was the fate of all things. His painting, like life itself, a moment of light bound to pass. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice that while he painted the Last Supper, he was also absorbed in countless other pursuits, designing stage sets for ducal entertainments, planning festivals where mechanical lions moved and opened to reveal lilies, sketching inventions of hydraulics and flight, dissecting bodies in search of anatomy secrets, for Leonardo was never one thing alone. And even as he worked on a masterpiece, his mind wandered toward the infinite. And as you breathe again, picture him late at night, returning from the convent to his studio, his apprentices asleep, the city quiet, Leonardo himself sitting at a table with a lamp flickering, his quill scratching notes in his backward script, lines of human muscles, designs of bridges, calculations of perspective, as though the Last Supper on the wall had only awakened in him more questions about motion, harmony, and truth. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how in Milan he found not only work but also companionship, apprentices who admired him, musicians with whom he played and sang, thinkers who shared their ideas, And though Leonardo never built a conventional household, his circle was warm, filled with the hum of conversation, of instruments, of shared meals, echoing perhaps the very scene he painted on the convent wall. And as you breathe softly, imagine the Last Supper as it first appeared, every face bright, every gesture clear, and imagine Leonardo himself standing back from the finished wall, tired but quietly content, knowing he had captured not only a story but a moment of humanity that would speak across centuries. And though time would erode the paint, the vision would remain eternal in its essence. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how the success of the Last Supper brought Leonardo renown, yet also deepened his restless spirit, for he had touched greatness but still longed for more knowledge, more projects, more horizons to cross, and soon the shifting politics of Milan would force him once again to seek a new path, carrying his genius onward like a flame shielded against the wind. And as the lamp of our telling grows dim, imagine Leonardo one evening alone in the refectory, gazing at the wall, the painted faces softly glowing in candlelight, perhaps whispering to himself lines of scripture, perhaps only listening to the silence, and then turning away, his footsteps echoing as he left the hall, leaving behind one of the world's great treasures, and carrying within him still the restless curiosity that no painting, however perfect, could ever exhaust. As the years unfolded in Milan, Leonardo's life became less the story of a painter at an easel and more that of a seeker surrounded by endless questions. For after pouring so much of himself into the Last Supper, he did not rest or retreat, but instead widened his gaze to embrace the workings of the human body, the flow of water, the mechanics of machines, and the hidden harmonies of the natural world. And as you breathe slowly, imagine him not in a grand hall now, but in quieter spaces, bending over parchment lit by lamplight, filling page after page with drawings, notes, diagrams, and observations, his quill moving steadily in mirrored script that few others could read, a secret language between himself and the future. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice how his curiosity led him into anatomy, where, with permission from hospitals and sometimes in secrecy, he studied the forms of the human body, dissecting with reverence, sketching with precision, and through his eyes, muscles, bones, veins, and organs became not gruesome realities but intricate wonders, each part serving the whole, and he wrote of the body as though it were a universe unto itself, built with a symmetry and logic that echoed the architecture of cathedrals or the mechanisms of machines. And as you breathe again, picture him drawing the curves of ribs, the delicate structure of the heart's chambers, the winding paths of veins and arteries. And alongside these studies he made notes of how the body moved, how a hand closed around an object, how a foot bore the weight of a step. And in these sketches he was not only recording what he saw, but also preparing to bring this knowledge into his paintings, where every gesture would ring true, every figure more alive because it was understood from within. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how his fascination with life itself extended beyond the body to the patterns of nature, the spirals of shells, the veins of leaves, the branching of trees, the eddies of rivers, all of them, to Leonardo, parts of the same great design. And he sought to map them, to capture their rhythms, convinced that mathematics and beauty were threads woven together by the same unseen hand. And as you breathe softly, imagine him wandering along canals near Milan, pausing to watch how water curved around obstacles, how whirlpools formed and dissolved, and then returning to his studio to sketch ideas for locks, dams, and channels that might tame and redirect rivers, for he believed the mastery of water was one of the keys to human progress. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice how his notebooks began to swell with inventions. Designs for flying machines with wings that flapped like birds, 4 parachutes shaped like pyramids, 4 armored vehicles bristling with weapons, for bridges that could be raised and lowered. And though many of these would not be built in his lifetime, each drawing was filled with an uncanny foresight, a vision centuries ahead of his age. And yet he did not boast of them or rush to publish them, content instead to fill his pages as though he were in conversation with time itself. And as you breathe again, imagine him testing small models, crafting with wood and cloths, smiling softly as they faltered, but also noting each flaw, learning from failure as much as from success, his patience unshaken, for to him the attempt was as precious as the outcome. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how this restless range sometimes worried his patrons. For while Ludovico Sforza valued his genius, he also desired results, paintings finished, machines constructed, sculptures completed, and Leonardo, so often moving from project to project, left some commissions delayed or abandoned. And yet Ludovico seemed to forgive him, perhaps sensing that to contain Leonardo was to dim the very spark that made him invaluable. And as you breathe softly, think of the colossal horse statue once more, Leonardo's grandest unfinished dream, and how even while that project stalled, his studies of horses enriched his notebooks with images of muscles, hooves, and motions so vivid that later generations would marvel at them. And though the bronze never poured, the vision lived on in line and parchment. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice how Leonardo's reputation spread not only as an artist, but as a man of endless talents, a figure at court whose presence brought prestige, and visitors to Milan sought him out, curious to see his sketches, to hear his ideas, to witness the strange blend of painter, engineer, musician, and philosopher that he embodied. And as you breathe again, imagine evenings in his Milanese rooms, where apprentices worked under his guidance, grinding pigments, tuning instruments, perhaps listening to him play the lyre, his music as gentle and inventive as his brush. The air filled not with the tension of deadlines, but with the hum of exploration. A workshop as much a laboratory of the mind as a studio of art. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how his attention turned often to the heavens, for he sketched the moon's surface, speculated about the nature of light, wondered about the movement of planets. And though his astronomy lacked the instruments of later centuries, his questions pointed forward, bridging art and science in ways that made even the stars feel closer to his hand. And as you breathe softly, think of how all these mechanics, hydraulics, flight, light, were not separate pursuits for him, but facets of one great search. For Leonardo believed that truth was unity, that painting, engineering, and philosophy were not rivals but companions, each revealing another angle of the same mysterious whole. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice that even as he sought this unity, time itself pressed on, and the world around him shifted. For politics in Milan grew uncertain, Ludovico's power wavering, threats gathering at the city's borders, and Leonardo, sensitive to the winds of change, must have wondered where his path would lead next, even as he filled his notebooks with dreams too vast for one lifetime. And as the lamp of our telling lowers, imagine him late at night, alone in his chamber, candlelight flickering over countless pages, his quill scratching softly. Diagrams of machines alongside sketches of smiling faces. The room quiet, except for his breath and the distant city sounds. And though the world outside prepared for turmoil, within these pages Leonardo was at peace. For here he could pursue his endless questions, safe, unhurried, timeless, as though whispering directly to us across the centuries. And with that gentle image of Leonardo lost in thought, while the night deepened around him, we step softly into the next chapter, where change will arrive in Milan, and the currents of war and politics will carry him onward. But the fire of curiosity will remain unbroken, steady as ever. The years in Milan had been filled with study and triumph, but history rarely allows any life to remain in stillness. And as the 15th century leaned toward its final decade, the calm of Leonardo's world began to tremble under the weight of politics and war, for Ludovico Sforzo's grip on Milan weakened. Foreign armies gathered at the edges of Italy, and shifting alliances meant that even the grandest courts could suddenly fall. And yet Leonardo himself, though living in the heart of this turbulence, seemed always to move in his own current, steady, thoughtful. A man walking calmly while the storm gathers around him, his notebooks still filling with sketches of machines, rivers, and faces, his eyes still seeking the hidden structures of nature. And as you breathe slowly, picture him in the castle of Milan, perhaps hearing distant whispers of French armies approaching. And yet at his desk he bends over a diagram of a flying machine, the scratching of quill against parchment far louder to him than the murmur of fear beyond the walls. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice how even in such uneasy times, Leonardo continued to receive commissions. For patrons still sought his genius, believing that beauty and invention might steady a world tilting toward chaos, and he painted portraits that captured souls with a quiet intensity. Among them, the lady with an ermine, where the sitter's delicate expression and the gentle fur of the animal in her arms became not just likenesses, but meditations on grace and presence, painted at a time when uncertainty pressed against every door. And as you breathe again, think of how Leonardo's relationship with Ludovico, though strained by unfinished works and shifting fortunes, endured because Ludovico recognized that in Leonardo's mind he held not just an artist but a symbol of Milan's sophistication, a treasure whose value went beyond the completion of any single canvas or sculpture. And yet, as Ludovico's enemies grew bolder, Leonardo must have felt the fragility of his position, the knowledge that even a genius depended upon the tides of power. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how Leonardo's own letters reveal his awareness of this instability. For he sometimes wrote of his skills as an engineer of fortifications, as if to remind patrons that he was not only a painter, but also a man who could design defenses, bridges, and machines of war. Though one senses in these words not eagerness for conflict, but a pragmatic offering, a way to secure his livelihood in uncertain days. And as you breathe softly, imagine him walking through Milan streets, seeing soldiers drilling, markets more hushed, citizens speaking with worry of the French king's advance. And perhaps Leonardo's mind, ever weaving, began to connect what he observed in war with what he sketched in peace. The forces of tension, motion, and balance present in both machines and in men. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice that when the French did at last descend upon Milan and Ludovico's power faltered, Leonardo did not resist or cling blindly, but adapted, as he always had, shifting his service, opening his books to new patrons, surviving not by force, but by the persistence of curiosity, which no invading army could silence. And as you breathe again, think of how remarkable it is that through all the upheavals of Italy, through wars, shifting dukes, and fallen states, Leonardo's work continued, flowing like a river that bends around rocks yet never ceases. And in those days of transition, he may have found more time for his studies, his dissections of the human body, his notes on flight, his drawings of plants and animals, the inward life deepening even as the outer world shook. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how this pattern of turmoil outside and vision inside would mark much of his life. Leonardo always slightly apart from the urgency of politics, a guest at the tables of princes but never entirely. Bound by them, his allegiance first and foremost to the mysteries he pursued on parchment. And as you breathe softly, imagine him taking refuge in quiet courtyards or cloisters, sketching in the shade, watching light fall across stone walls, as if to remind himself and those around him that while power rose and fell, beauty and knowledge endured. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how his reputation, now vast, made him a figure courted by more than one ruler, for in Florence, in Venice, in France itself, people spoke of him as the greatest mind of his time, a man whose presence could lend luster to any court. And thus, when Ludovico's fortunes waned, Leonardo did not vanish, but was drawn into new circles, new cities, carrying with him his notebooks, his instruments, and the calm certainty that wherever he went, his questions would follow. And as you breathe again, imagine him at night, as armies camped outside Milan, sitting in a small chamber, candlelight flickering over pages filled not with battles but with diagrams of water wheels, designs for canals, studies of human muscles, as if reminding himself that beyond the noise of war there was still the deeper music of nature, steady, eternal, waiting to be understood. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how this detachment was not indifference but a form of resilience. Leonardo seeking in his work a refuge from the instability of his age, offering through his paintings and designs glimpses of harmony, at a time when harmony seemed scarce, and in this way his art was not escapism but a gift, a lantern held aloft in darkness. And as you breathe softly, picture him leaving Milan in the wake of the French conquest, his possessions packed, his apprentices gathered, notebooks carefully bundled, stepping into a new chapter, uncertain of what awaited but unafraid, for his true dwelling was not any city or castle but the endless pages of his imagination, a place no army could capture. And with that quiet image of Leonardo walking onward while the world shifted behind him, we step softly toward the next part of his story, where Florence will once again open its gates to him, and where his genius, tempered by time and trial, will find new forms of expression. When Leonardo returned to Florence after the upheaval of Milan, it must have felt at once familiar and strangely altered, for the city of his youth still hummed with merchants and scholars, painters and poets. But he was no longer the young apprentice standing behind Verrocchio's shoulder. He was now a master in his own right, known across Italy, carrying with him the prestige of having served dukes and painted portraits that stirred whispers of wonder. And yet beneath that reputation was still the same restless mind, eager to see what Florence, with all its light and turbulence, might now offer. Imagine him arriving with apprentices at his side, notebooks bundled, stepping once more through the crowded streets where vendors called out the price of figs and spices, where bells from Santa Maria del Fiore marked the hours with their solemn rhythm, where wool merchants and bankers gathered in lodges to speak of trade. He may have felt the warmth of recognition, people turning their heads to see him pass, but also the pressure of expectation, for Florence was not easily impressed, and among its artists were men like Michelangelo, young and fiery, eager to prove their own genius. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how this tension, the city's eagerness for greatness, its competitive air-shaped Leonardo's next projects, and how, though often unfinished, they embodied his unending pursuit of perfection. One of the first great commissions that greeted him was the mural for the Council Hall of Florence, a vast space intended to display the city's glory, and Leonardo was asked to depict the Battle of Anghiari, a victory of Florentine arms. He accepted, setting his mind to the challenge of painting not just figures in conflict, but the very energy of motion, the twisting of bodies, the straining of horses, the raw immediacy of struggle captured on a wall larger than any canvas. Picture him preparing, sketching endlessly, filling pages with studies of horse anatomy, with the expressions of men caught in intensity, and though war itself was harsh, Leonardo's approach was not to glorify blood, but to explore the forms of movement, the way tension and balance revealed the inner mechanics of life. As you breathe slowly, imagine him standing before the blank wall, scaffoldings built, pigments prepared, apprentices bustling, yet his mind always reaching beyond technique, asking questions of how to fix energy itself in color and line. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how his experiments, though ambitious, ran into difficulties for Leonardo, always eager to test new methods, chose to use an encaustic technique painting with oils and applying heat to set the colors on when the heat was applied. The pigments began to run, the faces distorted, the forms blurring, until what was meant to be triumph became instead a fragment, admired for its vision but never completed. Yet even in failure, the sketches and fragments left behind influenced generations. For among those who studied them was young Raphael, who saw in Leonardo's studies a language of motion that would echo through his own works. And as you breathe again, think of how Florence, though proud, could also be unforgiving, and some whispered about Leonardo's tendency to leave works incomplete, his perfectionism leading him to abandon rather than settle. But others saw in him not neglect but a devotion to the pursuit itself, as if the act of searching mattered more than the arrival. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how, amid these public commissions, Leonardo also turned to more intimate works, and it was during this period that he painted what would become perhaps the most famous portrait in history. The Mona Lisa, though at the time she was simply Lisa del, the wife of a Florentine merchant, seated calmly as Leonardo applied brush to panno. Picture her enigmatic smile, the stillness of her hands, the soft landscape unfolding behind her, hills and waters blending into mystery. And remember that Leonardo carried this painting with him for years, refining, adjusting, never quite releasing it, as if in her expression he had captured not only a woman but the essence of humanity, poised between serenity and curiosity. As Florence bustled, Leonardo also delved deeper into his studies, dissecting human bodies with the permission of hospitals, sketching muscles, bones, and organs with precision so detailed that centuries later physicians would marvel at his accuracy. Imagine him in a quiet chamber, candles flickering, tools laid out carefully, his quill moving across parchment, recording what he saw with both the eye of a scientist and the soul of an artist. The lines graceful yet exact, his notes filled with observations about how the heart's valves worked, how the lungs expanded, how the fetus rested in the womb. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how extraordinary this was. For while others might have recoiled, Leonardo saw in the human body the same elegance he found in rivers or machines, everything governed by proportion, balance, and harmony. And he believed that, to understand the world, one must first understand oneself. And yet, as always, Florence's political winds shifted, and Leonardo, though admired, did not always find stability. He moved between patrons, between projects, sometimes leaving the city to serve in other courts, yet always returning, drawn to the place where his roots lay. Breathe softly and picture him walking through the Piazza della Signoria at twilight, the statues casting long shadows, the chatter of citizens echoing, his cloak brushing the stones. And perhaps he felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that he had come far since the days of apprenticeship, that now, even as rivals like Michelangelo rose, his own name was spoken with reverence. Stay with me, because, in a moment, you'll notice how his story in Florence during this time was not only about art, but about how he balanced the demands of a restless city with his own endless search. A search that cared less for applause than for understanding, less for completed monuments than for the truth hidden within motion, form, and life itself. And so, as we step softly toward the next part of his journey, you might imagine Leonardo closing his notebooks at the end of a long day, laying down his quill, extinguishing the candle, and gazing out at the Arno River flowing quietly in the moonlight, a reminder that time, like water, moves steadily forward, carrying him and us toward new discoveries waiting just beyond the horizon. Florence, in the first years of the 16th century, was alive with a kind of restless brilliance, a city where art and politics intertwined so closely that one could hardly separate brushstrokes from banners, sculpture from state. Leonardo had returned to this stage as a man seasoned by Milan, with the quiet weight of experience in his eyes, and yet he found himself in the company of a new generation, fierce and ambitious, none more so than Michelangelo, whose chisel carved figures of startling energy and whose temper, unlike Leonardo's, was sharp and unyielding. Imagine the two of them, both Florentine, both lauded, both carrying reputations that filled the streets with whispers, and yet so different. Leonardo graceful, measured, slow, content to linger in thought. Michelangelo fiery, quick to passion, relentless in pursuit of his visions. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice how Florence itself seemed to delight in their rivalry, setting the stage for one of the most remarkable competitions in the history of art, a contest not of war but of vision, though no less intense for being fought with charcoal and pigment rather than swords. The Council of Florence, seeking to adorn its great hall, decided not on one but two monumental frescoes, one entrusted to Leonardo, the other to Michelangelo. For Leonardo, the subject was the Battle of Anghiari, which he had already begun to explore, and for Michelangelo, the Battle of Castina, another Florentine victory equally dramatic. Picture them in adjacent halls, apprentices carrying in vast sheets of paper, walls prepared with plaster, scaffolding erected, the air thick with the smell of lime and pigment. Leonardo, tall and elegant, moved with calm authority, sketching studies of horses rearing, men grappling, the chaos of battle compressed into swirling forms. Michelangelo, younger but already intense, filled his sheets with muscular figures, nude soldiers caught mid-motion, their bodies taut with energy, and in the streets of Florence, people murmured of who would triumph, whose vision would outshine the other, though in truth both works would remain unfinished. Their glory preserved not in the final murals, but in the sketches and cartoons that artists flocked to see. For the very preparations themselves became legends, studied for decades after. As you breathe slowly, imagine walking into the hall where Leonardo's great cartoon of the Battle of Anghiari was displayed. By candlelight, the figures seemed almost alive. Horses twisting, men shouting silently. Lines that pulsed with urgency, yet held together with balance, a fusion of motion and order. Artists from across Italy came to trace the outlines, to learn from the master's hand, to carry away fragments of his vision into their own works. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how even Michelangelo, though fiery, could not deny the power of Leonardo's design. And though his own cartoon, showing soldiers surprised while bathing in the Arno, was equally admired, the contrast between the two revealed their temperaments. Leonardo's measured, filled with interwoven forms, Michelangelo's explosive, each figure a study in muscle and strain. The city became a gallery of debate, taverns echoing with arguments over which was superior, patrons watching with keen interest, apprentices slipping between the two halls, their eyes wide with wonder, and yet, as always with Leonardo, the work was left incomplete. His experiments with technique faltered, the materials betrayed him, and soon his wall began to fail, pigments running, surfaces refusing to hold. Michelangelo, too, was drawn away by the colossal commission of the Sistine Chapel ceiling in Rome, leaving Florence with two unfinished yet unforgettable beginnings, fragments that inspired more than many finished works ever could. As you breathe again, think of how telling this is of Leonardo's life, that even what he did not finish carried a weight, a beauty, a legacy that endured. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how this period in Florence was not only about rivalry, but also about Leonardo's continued explorations into every subject that caught his mind. For while others might focus entirely on one commission, he balanced painting with anatomy, mechanics with geometry, always returning to his notebooks as to a trusted friend in those same years. Leonardo deepened his dissections of the human form, creating drawings so exact that modern eyes marvel still. Picture him bending over a cadaver in the dim light of a Florentine hospital. Tools at hand, apprentices, perhaps uneasy but obedient, as he drew tendons and ligaments with a patience that revealed not only structure but a kind of reverence. His notes written backwards in his mirror script, his illustrations blending clarity with grace. He studied the heart, the brain, the curvature of the spine, believing that to know the body was to approach the secrets of life itself. And at the same time, his fascination with motion led him to observe the flight of birds, filling pages with diagrams of wings, air currents, and machines that might one day lift a man into the sky. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how this constant expansion of his studies left him vulnerable to criticism. For while Florence admired genius, it also demanded results, and some grew impatient with his unwillingness to complete what he began. Yet Leonardo, ever calm, ever absorbed, seemed less concerned with applause than with the quiet thrill of discovery. As you breathe softly, imagine him walking through Florence at twilight, his cloak wrapped against the cool air, stopping by the Arno River to watch the water glide. Perhaps he carried a small notebook, pausing to sketch eddies, to calculate the way currents swirled around stones, his mind as alive with questions as the river itself was alive with motion. Around him the city bustled with entreaty priests preaching, merchants bargaining, children playing, but within him there was always the deeper current, a search that no distraction could silence. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how even in the rivalry with Michelangelo, Leonardo seemed to float above the heat of competition, aware of it, shaped by it, yet not consumed. He admired what was strong in others, and though he may have bristled at times under comparison, his work remained his own, inseparable from the way he saw the world. This chapter of his life in Florence shows us not just an artist among rivals, but a man caught between expectation and inner calling, between public commissions and private studies. And though the Battle of Unghiari faded into legend, its sketches carried forward, influencing Raphael, inspiring sculptors, reminding all who saw them that genius does not always culminate in permanence, but sometimes in fleeting glimpses, enough to light the path for others. As you breathe again, let that thought rest with you, that what we begin, even if left unfinished, can ripple outward, shaping lives long after the moment has passed. And with that gentle truth, we follow Leonardo onward, as Florence once again gave way to new journeys, his restless steps carrying him beyond the city of his birth, toward Rome and eventually to France, where the last chapters of his extraordinary life would quietly unfold. When Leonardo left Florence behind once more and turned his steps toward Rome, it was not the Rome of ancient emperors that awaited him, though the ruins still stood, haunting reminders of past glories. It was the Rome of popes and cardinals, of artists gathering under papal patronage, of a court where faith and power intertwined in ways both magnificent and precarious. Imagine Leonardo arriving in the eternal city, his beard now long and flowing, his years pressing gently upon him, but his eyes still bright with curiosity, the notebooks still growing heavier with sketches and notes. Rome at this time was a magnet for talent, for Raphael had risen there, his frescoes glowing in the papal apartments, and Michelangelo, ever intense, had taken on the monumental task of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, his figures straining with divine energy high above worshippers' heads. Leonardo entered this stage not as the fiery youth but as the seasoned master, admired, revered, and yet, curiously, less central to the drama than he had once been. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how Rome offered him both a stage and a shadow, a place where he pursued his studies with fervor, even as others captured more immediate glory. The Vatican itself was alive with activity, corridors echoing with the footsteps of priests, scholars, diplomats, and artisans. In courtyards, sculptors carved marble for fountains, while inside, painters climbed scaffolds to spread color across walls that seemed almost endless. Leonardo was welcomed under the protection of Giuliano de' Medici, brother to Pope Leo X, who admired his brilliance and gave him lodging and freedom to work. Picture him in his Roman workshop, the light falling through high windows onto piles of sketches, tools, and strange instruments of his own design, lenses, anatomical models, models of bridges and cranes. He spent long hours here, sometimes with apprentices, often alone, the silence broken only by the faint scratching of quill on parchment or the gentle grind of pigments. As you breathe slowly, imagine how the outside world of Rome, with its politics and rivalries, must have felt distant compared to the intimacy of these quiet hours. Leonardo's world reduced to candlelight ink and the endless mysteries of nature. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice how, even in this city of grandeur, Leonardo's curiosity never shrank. He dissected corpses with the help of physicians, continuing his detailed studies of anatomy, refining his understanding of muscles, the heart, and the brain. He filled page after page with exquisite drawings that seemed less like cold diagrams than like meditations on the miracle of the human body. He studied optics, experimenting with how light entered the eye, how the pupil adjusted, how shadows fell across curved surfaces. He examined plants, noting how leaves spiraled along stems, always in patterns of proportion, harmony repeating itself in the smallest detail. And beyond these natural studies, he explored engineering, sketching devices that could drain marshes, lift heavy stones, or channel rivers, still convinced that human ingenuity, guided by observation, could reshape the world. And yet, as you breathe again, think of the strange paradox. Here was Leonardo, the great name of Florence and Milan, laboring quietly while younger artists seized the great commissions of the age. Raphael charmed the papal court with frescoes of philosophers and saints, his school of Athens capturing the dream of harmony between classical wisdom and Christian faith. Michelangelo, high on his scaffolds, painted with a fury that left his muscles aching but produced visions that astonished all who saw them. Leonardo, older now, slower in his work, seemed almost apart. His brilliance still unquestioned, but his pace at odds with Rome's appetite for visible achievement. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how this was not failure, but rather the deepening of his inward journey. A turning of focus from the applause of courts to the quiet joy of understanding itself. Still, commissions came. He was asked to devise projects for waterworks, to design plans for draining the Pontine marshes, to study fortifications. He experimented with materials, always searching for new methods, though often frustrated when the results faltered. In painting, he began works, but left many incomplete, his perfectionism and curiosity pulling him onward before any piece could be declared finished. Perhaps the most telling was his ongoing devotion to the Mona Lisa, still in his possession, still refined stroke by stroke, as if her gaze were both companion and challenge, a reminder of the elusive perfection he pursued. As you breathe softly, imagine Leonardo walking through Rome's ruins at twilight, the broken arches of the Colosseum casting long shadows, columns half buried in earth, wild plants curling over fallen stones. He must have felt the weight of history pressing against him, the grandeur of what had been and the fragility of what remained. Perhaps he paused to sketch a fragment of column, or to note how time itself erodes even the mightiest structures, and in that observation found a kind of kinship. For he too was aware of his own aging body, the silver in his hair, the ache in his hands. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice how Rome was both a place of inspiration and of quiet melancholy for him. A city where he stood in the company of giants, yet walked his own path, slower, deeper, content to follow the lines of inquiry wherever they led, even if they never produced the monumental canvases or ceilings that others created. It is easy, looking back, to wonder if Leonardo felt overshadowed in Rome, but perhaps it is more gentle to imagine that he simply saw differently. Where Michelangelo strained upward to paint the very vault of heaven, Leonardo bent downward to observe the spiral of a snail's shell. Where Raphael arranged great philosophers in dialogue, Leonardo traced the valves of the heart with a surgeon's precision. Each had his gift, his calling, and Leonardo's was not diminished by comparison, but merely placed on another plane. One quieter, perhaps less celebrated in his lifetime, but enduring in its own way. As the years passed, his notebooks grew thicker, filled with musings that ranged from the practical to the poetic. He wrote of how water moves like hair, curling and twisting in currents. He wrote of how the earth itself might be a living body, with rivers as its veins, rocks as its bones. He designed flying machines that stretched wings like bats, that flapped like birds, though he knew they might never rise. He reflected on art, on the nature of vision, on the painter's duty to capture not just form but the soul of what he saw. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll see how these notes, scattered and never published in his lifetime, were the true cathedral he built, vast, unfinished, but filled with corridors of wonder that future generations would wonder. And as you breathe again, picture Leonardo in his final Roman years, walking slowly through gardens, stopping to watch the way light filtered through leaves, pausing at fountains to note how water sparkled, or sitting in his chamber, candlelight flickering over a page where a heart, a bird, and a machine might appear side by side. His rivals might have painted ceilings or ruled workshops, but he continued his quiet dialogue with nature, steady, unhurried, like a man listening for whispers that others overlooked. Thus his time in Rome, though not crowned with great public triumphs, was nonetheless rich, a season of gathering, of distilling wisdom, of preparing, perhaps, for the final chapters of his life. And when at last he left Rome behind to journey toward France, it was not as a man defeated, but as one still searching, carrying his notebooks as companions, the Mona Lisa as a treasured confidant, and the endless questions of his mind as lanterns that no distance, no decline could ever extinguish. And with that gentle thought, we step softly too, leaving Rome's bustling corridors and quiet ruins, and preparing to follow Leonardo on the path that would lead him to the court of the French king, where his final days would be spent not in frenzy, but in the peace of reflection. The journey that carried Leonardo from Italy to France was not the bold, triumphant march of a conqueror, but the measured, thoughtful passage of a man nearing the last stage of his life. And yet within him there still burned the same quiet fire that had guided him since his boyhood in Vinci. Imagine him preparing to leave Rome, gathering not so much possessions of grandeur as the things he treasured most, his notebooks, filled with sketches and words that had become the truest map of his mind. The painting of the Mona Lisa, which he had kept close for years, brushing and refining as though it were both companion and mirror, and a few trusted apprentices and assistants who would become like family. As he stepped away from Italy, he was leaving behind the courts of Florence, Milan, and Rome, where his name had long been spoken with reverence, and yet he was not diminished in spirit. For another court awaited him, one across the mountains and rivers, where the King of France himself desired his presence. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how this journey, though slow and quiet, held within it the dignity of a man carrying not monuments of stone, but the weightless treasures of imagination. The roads to France wound through landscapes that Leonardo must have loved to observe. Rolling hills gave way to valleys where rivers shone like ribbons of silver beneath the sun. Forests whispered with the rustle of leaves, and villages dotted the countryside with the smell of bread baking in stone ovens, the sound of children laughing in the lanes. As you breathe slowly, picture him riding gently along these paths, pausing often to sketch the curve of a riverbank or the wings of a bird, his eyes ever curious, even as the years pressed upon his body. Perhaps he stopped at inns, where the firelight warmed his hands, his apprentices arranging his precious notebooks with care, their voices hushed with respect, for they must have known they were accompanying not just a master, but a man whose mind had reshaped the way people would see the world. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice how this movement toward France was also a movement inward. A shift from striving toward a kind of acceptance, a readiness to place himself in the quiet safety of a foreign king's court, where he might finally rest. King Francis I of France, young, ambitious, and eager to surround himself with brilliance, welcomed Leonardo with warmth. He granted him the manor of Close-Luce, near the grand chateau of Ambience, a residence with gentle gardens and views of the Loire Valley. Imagine Leonardo walking slowly through its halls, the wooden beams above him, the windows opening to vineyards and orchards, the air fresher than the crowded streets of Rome. Here, in this calm setting, he could continue his work at a gentler pace, supported by the generosity of a king who saw in him not merely an artist, but a symbol of Renaissance genius itself. Francis valued conversation with Leonardo, often seeking his thoughts, not only on art, but on philosophy, on nature, on the very fabric of life. As you breathe again, picture the two of them seated together, the young monarch listening intently, the older master speaking softly, perhaps gesturing with his hands as he explained the flow of water, or the way a bird balances on the wind. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how in France, though his hands grew less steady and his body less agile, Leonardo's mind never ceased its quiet explorations. He continued to draw, to write, to refine. He returned often to his studies of water, filling pages with observations of currents, eddies, and waves, as though he were conversing with the river itself. He wrote reflections on mortality, on the brevity of life, yet without bitterness, as if he understood that the flow of time was simply another current, carrying him as surely as it carried rivers to the sea. His Mona Lisa remained with him, a constant presence, her gaze following him through the chambers of Close-Luce, her smile unchanged though the world around him shifted. Breathe softly, and imagine Leonardo sitting before her in the quiet of evening, candlelight flickering across her enigmatic face, his own lined with years but lit still by curiosity, as if they were two old companions keeping watch together, even in his later years. Leonardo did not retreat entirely from invention. He sketched designs for ideal cities, for canals that could improve transport, for bridges that could span wide rivers. He drew machines, some whimsical, some practical, still convinced that human ingenuity could mirror the patterns of nature. His apprentices, faithful, worked at his side, helping to organize the vast collection of notebooks, each page a window into his restless spirit. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll notice how in France, unlike in Italy, there was less pressure to deliver grand commissions, less demand for public triumphs. Instead, he was cherished for who he was, allowed to be at peace with his unending search, and in this freedom, his final years took on a gentleness that perhaps Italy had rarely afforded him. The gardens of Close-Luce became his sanctuary. He would walk among the trees, pausing to observe how branches bent under the weight of fruit, how vines curled around trellises, how light shifted through leaves at different hours of the day. He compared the patterns of leaves to the branching of rivers, always seeing in the smallest detail the echo of larger truths. The Loire River itself, winding nearby, may have reminded him of the Arno, its currents stirring the same reflections he had carried since youth. As you breathe slowly, imagine him by the water's edge, notebook in hand, sketching even as age stiffened his fingers, the sound of birds above him, the scent of earth and grass carrying through the air. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how the presence of King Francis brought Leonardo both comfort and dignity. The young king would sometimes visit Clos Luce, crossing the short path from Ambience, speaking with Leonardo in his chambers. Their conversations, though undocumented in detail, must have ranged widely art science, philosophy, two men of different generations sharing thoughts as equals. Francis reportedly said that no man had ever lived who knew as much as Leonardo, and one can imagine the warmth in his tone, the respect shining through. For Leonardo, after a lifetime of moving between patrons, some supportive, some demanding, this trust must have been a balm, allowing him to end his days in an atmosphere of friendship and honor. And yet, as his health declined, Leonardo began to put his affairs in order. He organized his manuscripts, entrusted them to his beloved pupil, Francesco Melzi, ensuring that his words and drawings would endure even after his hand no longer moved across the page. He dictated his thoughts, reflecting on life, on art, on the fleetingness of time. In these writings, one senses both resignation and serenity, as though he had come to accept that the great cathedral of his work would remain unfinished, but that the beauty of it lay precisely in its incompletion, in its endless invitation for others to continue the search. Breathe softly, and imagine him at his desk in his final months, his quill slower, his breath deeper, the candlelight gentle on parchment, his thoughts turning not to regret but to gratitude for the rivers he had studied, the skies he had sketched, the faces he had painted, the questions that had carried him forward. Thus the journey to France was not an end but a transformation. It was a laying down of burdens, a passing into peace, a recognition that what he had offered to the world was not only in the canvases and machines, but in the spirit of curiosity itself. And as you breathe again, picture him walking slowly through the halls of Clos Luce one last time, pausing to look upon the Mona Lisa, pausing to look out the window at the Loire, pausing to listen to the murmur of leaves in the wind, and know that he carried with him to the very end the same quiet wonder that had stirred him as a boy in Vinci, watching birds rise into the sky. And with that image of Leonardo's final journey into tranquility, we too step softly forward, ready to follow him into the closing chapters of his life, where the threads of art, science, and memory weave together into a lasting tapestry. Life at Clos Luce unfolded with a rhythm that was both gentle and steady, a pace that seemed to suit Leonardo in his final years, for here he was no longer caught in the storms of politics or the rivalries of artists, but settled instead into a pattern of reflection, study, and quiet creation. Imagine the mornings beginning with soft light streaming through the windows, the Loire Valley outside shimmering with mist rising from the river, and Leonardo sitting by a wooden desk, his quill poised over parchment, his notebooks ready to receive another flow of thoughts. Around him, apprentices and assistants moved with care, respectful of his age, yet attentive to his needs, for they knew they were witnessing the final chapter of a man whose mind had reshaped the world. Francesco Melzi, his closest pupil, stayed faithfully by his side, often organizing his master's scattered manuscripts, while younger helpers prepared pigments, sharpened quills, or simply observed in silence, absorbing what they could from his wisdom. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice how the daily life of Clos Luce, though simple, was filled with a richness of detail that reveals as much about Leonardo as any grand, painting or invention. The manor itself was not vast, but its warmth lay in its intimacy. Stone walls thickened the rooms against the weather. Wooden beams lined the ceilings, and gardens spread outward in neat but welcoming designs. Leonardo loved to walk those gardens, even as age slowed his steps, stopping to touch a leaf, to note how the vine curled, to observe how shadows shifted hour by hour. Breathe softly, and picture him leaning on a walking stick, his robe brushing the gravel path, an apprentice nearby ready to steady him, while he paused to sketch a flower or to murmur a thought about the proportion of its petals. He had always seen the world in patterns, and even in these gardens, perhaps he compared the branches to the networks of veins in the body, or the curling of vines to the spirals of seashells. For him, daily life was never separate from inquiry. Every moment was a chance to learn, every walk a lesson written in the language of nature. Meals at Close Loose were simple but nourishing. Bread baked fresh, cheese from local dairies, fish from the Loire, and sometimes fruits and wine from the valley's orchards and vineyards. Imagine Leonardo sitting at the table with his apprentices, speaking softly between bites, perhaps explaining how the motion of water in the river resembled the flow of blood, or how the way light played across the surface of a grape revealed truths about reflection and color. These conversations, gentle and unhurried, must have been as nourishing to his companions as the food itself. For in Leonardo's presence, even a meal became a classroom. Every object and every taste a gateway to thought. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how these small moments, these ordinary rituals, carried within them the essence of his genius, a way of finding wonder in the everyday. In the afternoons, he often returned to his workroom. Though his hands had grown weaker, his apprentices assisted him, holding tools, turning pages, mixing paints. He dictated notes when his fingers could no longer keep up, his words still flowing with clarity, still reaching outward to capture what he observed. He returned again to his studies of water, filling entire sections with diagrams of eddies, whirlpools, and waves, convinced that the secret of motion was written most clearly in rivers. He sketched machines still, though less with the expectation of construction and more as an act of meditation. Diagrams of gears, pulleys, and flying devices that had long filled his imagination. Breathe again, and picture him bending over these pages, the candlelight glowing warmly, his white beard falling to his chest, his eyes focused with the same intensity they had carried since childhood. Evenings at Close Loose often brought visits from the court of King Francis. The young monarch, fascinated by Leonardo, would sometimes walk across from the chateau of Amboise to sit in conversation with him. Imagine them together, the king vibrant with youth, the master gentle with age, speaking of philosophy, of art, of science, perhaps even of the mysteries of the soul. Francis admired Leonardo deeply, and Leonardo, in turn, seemed to find comfort in the respect and affection offered him. After so many years of navigating uncertain patronage in Italy, stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice how this relationship gave Leonardo something rare, a peaceful environment, where he was valued not for what he produced immediately, but for who he was and what he had already given. In this companionship, he could relax, speak freely, and simply be. The apprentices at Close Loose carried their own rhythms too. They copied from Leonardo's notebooks, learning his script and his techniques. They listened to his lectures, sometimes stern, often gentle, always filled with insight. They helped him preserve his works, for he was deeply aware that his time was growing short. and he wanted his writings to endure. Francesco Melzi, especially, took on the role of caretaker, preparing to inherit the responsibility of guarding the treasure of Leonardo's thoughts. Breathe softly and imagine the manor at night, its rooms lit by a scattering of candles, the apprentices bent over parchment, copying carefully. The only sounds, the scratching of quills and the faint crackle of fire. It was a household bound not by blood but by devotion, each person aware that they lived within the orbit of genius, each moment imbued with reverence. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how even as age weighed on Leonardo's body, his curiosity never ceased. He reflected on the heavens, writing notes on astronomy, considering how the earth moved within the cosmos. He studied geology, thinking about the layering of rocks and the fossils found within them, suggesting that the earth was far older than many believed. He thought about mathematics, about proportion and perspective, refining theories that blended art and science into harmony. Each day, each hour, was a continuation of the lifelong journey he had begun as a child sketching in Vinci, and though he may have known he would not live to see all his questions answered, he seemed content to pass them forward, leaving clues, leaving hints, leaving maps for others to follow. The Loire Valley itself must have soothed him. Its rolling hills, its fertile fields, its calm river flowing with steady grace, all of it provided a background of peace. Imagine him sitting in the garden at sunset, the sky painted in muted pinks and golds, the air filled with the scent of earth cooling after the heat of day. Perhaps he held the Mona Lisa nearby, still adjusting, still touching, her face glowing softly in the fading light. Perhaps he simply sat and listened, the rustle of trees, the call of birds, the hum of insects, as if all of nature were speaking to him in the language. He had spent his life learning, and as you breathe again, think of how daily life at Close Loose, though outwardly simple, was, in truth, the culmination of everything Leonardo had sought. Here, in the quiet, he could merge all his identities, the painter, the engineer, the anatomist, the dreamer, without the demand to prove himself, without the pressure of rivals or patrons. His life became like a slow river, no longer rushing, but flowing steadily toward the sea, carrying with it the reflections of mountains, skies, and forests he had passed along the way. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll see that this gentle rhythm was itself a masterpiece, the art of living well after a lifetime of searching. So, when we think of Leonardo in his final years, let us not imagine decline, but rather completion, a man surrounded by students, friends, and the beauty of the French countryside. His notebooks overflowing, his mind still turning, his days filled with quiet wonder. And as we close this chapter, picture him extinguishing the candle at his desk, the room falling into darkness, the Loire glimmering faintly in the moonlight beyond, and know that the story of Leonardo's daily life at Close Loose was as rich, as profound as any painting he ever made. As the seasons turned at Close Loose, Leonardo found himself more often in contemplation than in active creation. His hands, once so quick with quill and brush, had slowed, and yet his mind remained restless, wandering across the landscapes of memory and philosophy. He had walked so many roads: Florence, Milan, Venice, Rome. Now embosomed, in each city he had gathered questions, each era of his life layering upon the last like strokes of paint, forming an unfinished canvas. Now, as the Loire Valley lay quiet outside his windows, he seemed to draw all those threads together, weaving them into reflections on mortality, on the passing of time, and on the meaning of the life he had lived. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice that Leonardo's meditations at the end of his life reveal as much about his genius as any of his works ever could. Mortality had always fascinated him, though he rarely spoke of it in fear or sorrow. In his anatomical studies, he had dissected cadavers with the precision of a scientist, sketching the layers of muscle, the twisting of veins, the architecture of bone. Yet, for him, the body was not a morbid puzzle. It was a miracle of design, a temple of mechanics and spirit. At close loose, he returned often to those drawings, his hands gently tracing the lines he had made decades earlier. He must have seen in them not only the evidence of mortality, but also the brilliance of nature's engineering, as if the human frame itself was a divine invention. Breathe slowly and imagine him sitting in candlelight, turning the pages of his old notebooks, his eyes lingering on the delicate sketches of hands, shoulders, ribs, as though each drawing whispered both fragility and eternity. Still, he was human, and the awareness of death's nearness must have pressed gently at the edge of his thoughts. He was around 67, older than many men of his century lived to be, his body carrying the weight of years of labor. He wrote once that while I thought I was learning how to live, I have been learning how to die. But this was not despair, it was clarity, a recognition that life and death were not enemies, but partners in the same cycle. To Leonardo, the falling of a leaf in autumn was no tragedy, for it nourished the soil from which new life would rise. In this way, he seemed to approach his own mortality as the closing of a chapter in the great book of nature, a necessary step in the eternal unfolding of creation. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how his bond with King Francis offered him solace in these final reflections, giving warmth to thoughts that might otherwise have felt cold. Francis admired Leonardo deeply, treating him not as a servant, but as a wise elder, a companion in thought. The young king would cross from the chateau of Angbours to Close Loose, sometimes unannounced, eager to sit by the master's side. Picture them in the garden, the king vibrant with youth and vigor, Leonardo wrapped in his cloak against the chill, the two of them conversing in soft tones. They spoke of art, Francis longing to fill his court with beauty and glory, and of science, of machines and the mysteries of nature. But more than these, they may have spoken of philosophy, of what it meant to live well, of what legacy meant, of how knowledge could shape the future. For Francis, these talks were treasures. For Leonardo, they must have been comforts, a reminder that his voice still mattered, that his wisdom would not vanish with him. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, that Leonardo died in the arms of King Francis. Whether literally true or not, it reflects the depth of their bond. Francis called him my father, and Leonardo seemed to find in the young monarch the son he had never had, someone who valued him not only for his skills, but for his being. In those evenings, when the court grew quiet and the candles flickered low, one imagines the king leaning close, listening as Leonardo spoke of the soul, of the stars, of the endless questions that had guided his life. Breathe again and think of that room. Stone walls, tapestries muffling the air, the warmth of fire casting golden light, the greatest mind of the Renaissance speaking softly, and a young king leaning forward, listening with reverence. Leonardo's reflections stretched beyond mortality into legacy. What would remain of him? He knew that his paintings, even the few he had completed, would endure. The Mona Lisa, the Last Supper, the Virgin of the Rocks, these works carried a mystery that would long outlive him. Yet he may have worried about his notebooks, his inventions, his countless sketches and diagrams. Would they be preserved, or would they be scattered, forgotten in drawers and libraries? He entrusted them largely to Francesco Melzi, knowing that his loyal pupil would protect them. But still, there must have been unease, for Leonardo's writings were not neatly organized treatises. They were sprawling, cryptic, filled with mirrored script and marginal notes. He left behind not polished answers, but questions, maps of thought, fragments of insight. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was intentional. For Leonardo himself was a question, a man defined not by certainty but by wonder. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how even in the shadow of mortality, Leonardo's mind never turned away from beauty. He still found himself drawn to light the way dawn spread across the Loire, the way a candle glowed within a glass, the way the moonlight touched the stone of Ambience at night. He still spoke of proportion, of harmony, of the golden ratio that linked shells to galaxies. He still dreamed of flight, sometimes watching birds circle above the valley, wondering if one day, far in the future, humanity would soar as he had once envisioned. His body may have slowed, but his imagination roamed freely, untethered, unbound, alive, and so, as the evenings deepened at Close Loose, Leonardo sat surrounded by friends, apprentices, and the presence of the king, reflecting on a life both brilliant and incomplete. For all he had accomplished, he had always felt he had left much undone, always chasing mysteries just beyond reach. Yet in this incompleteness lay his greatness, for it meant his curiosity never dimmed, his questions never ceased. In the hush of his final years, among candlelight and gentle voices, he found peace not in answers but in the embrace of the eternal quest. And as you breathe slowly, imagine him closing his eyes, not in fear but in wonder, as though he were preparing not for an end, but for another beginning. At Close Loose, Leonardo's days increasingly returned to one subject that had fascinated him all his life: the movement of water. If you picture him in the quiet of his chamber, quill in hand, parchment spread out before him, you can almost hear the slow, steady rhythm of his thoughts as he drew wave after wave, spiral after spiral, tracing the eternal dance of rivers, storms, and seas. For him, water was not simply a substance to drink or a river to cross. It was the blood of the earth, the force that connected sky and soil, mountain and valley, storm and calm. Even in his final years, as his body grew fragile, he could not resist the lure of understanding it more deeply. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice how his meditations on water became meditations on life itself, its cycles, its flows, its endless transformations. Leonardo had written before that water was the vehicle of nature. He observed how it carved valleys, smoothed stones, nourished plants, and wore down even the strongest walls. At Close Loose, he sketched rivers of the Loire, its currents bending around islands, its banks shifting with the seasons. He watched raindrops sliding down the glass panes of his chamber window, tracing their merging, their branching, their playful weaving. He must have seen in each drop a miniature world, echoing the larger flows of oceans and clouds. As you breathe gently, imagine him pausing to touch the window with his finger, following the path of a droplet, his mind already turning it into a symbol for human life separate at first, then merging, then vanishing into something larger. He studied floods too, the destructive power of water when released, His notebooks are filled with violent sketches of torrents crashing against bridges, of waves breaking upon cities, of rivers overflowing with fury. Yet even these he rendered not with fear, but with awe, recognizing in them the raw strength of nature. At close loose, with the Loire's calm waters flowing just beyond his garden, he must have remembered these sketches, reflecting on the balance between stillness and storm, how in every gentle stream there also lived the possibility of flood. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how this reflection guided his thoughts on the fragility of human works. Compared to the resilience of nature, Leonardo had often compared the flow of rivers to the flow of blood in the body. Just as veins carried life through flesh, rivers carried life across land. At close loose, he returned to these metaphors, his mind drifting between anatomy and hydrology, between man and earth. He might have said to his pupils, "See how the Loire bends. How it branches, so too does the human heart send forth its vessels." He believed the same laws governed all things, that patterns echoed across scales, from droplets to oceans, from organs to planets. Breathe again, and picture him pointing with a trembling hand at a sketch. His eyes alight as he explained to Francesco Melzi that the human body was a microcosm of the earth itself. But beyond the science, water became for Leonardo a way of thinking about his own life. He had flowed from place to place, Florence, Milan, Venice, Rome, Ambience, sometimes gently, sometimes with turbulence. He had carved his path through courts and workshops, through triumphs and disappointments, leaving behind traces like eddies in sand. And now, in the Loire Valley, he felt himself approaching the sea, where all rivers meet. This was not a source of sorrow. It was a recognition of belonging. Just as rivers lose themselves in oceans, so too would he, returning his spark to the larger stream of nature. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how this metaphor gave him peace in the face of mortality. His apprentices noticed how often he returned to water in conversation. At meals, he might compare the pouring of wine into a cup with the joining of streams. In the garden, he would pause to watch dew gather on leaves, speaking softly about how the smallest droplets reflected the entire sky. At night, he sometimes listened to the rain on the roof, murmuring about the music of falling water, how each drop had traveled through clouds, air, and earth, completing a journey no less noble than that of kings. Imagine the household at such times, the apprentices quiet, listening in reverence, the candlelight flickering, the steady rhythm of rain blending with the rhythm of Leonardo's voice, weaving science into poetry, teaching not with diagrams, but with wonder. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how even in these reflections, Leonardo's curiosity about water connected to his dreams of invention. He had once designed canals, irrigation systems, and machines to harness currents. At close loose, he still reviewed those drawings, considering how rivers could be redirected, how floods could be prevented, how mills could turn endlessly with the push of a stream. He believed water held the key to power, to prosperity, to survival. And though he no longer expected to build such machines himself, he must have hoped that one day others would. His notebooks, thick with sketches of locks and sluices, were gifts to the future, blueprints for engineers yet unborn. But perhaps most striking was how he saw water not as inert, but as alive. He called it the driver of nature, giving it almost a soul, as if streams carried intention, as if waves had memory. In this, he echoed philosophies both ancient and mystical, ideas that blurred the line between science and spirituality. To him, water was not simply physical. It was symbolic, a teacher of patience and strength, of yielding and persistence. It wore down stone not by force, but by constancy. And perhaps Leonardo saw in this a mirror of his own persistence, decades of observation, decades of questioning, until even the hardest mysteries began to yield. Breathe slowly, and imagine him walking by the Loire at dusk, leaning on his staff, the river glowing silver beneath the moon. The air is cool, the garden quiet, and the water moves with endless calm. He stops, gazes at the current, and perhaps whispers to himself, "Here is truth." For Leonardo, truth was never hidden in grand palaces or lofty speeches, but in the quiet flow of nature. The river did not argue, did not deceive. It simply moved, always forward, always returning, always teaching. And in that lesson, Leonardo found comfort. So when we think of Leonardo's final meditations, let us see him not only as painter, inventor, or scientist, but as a philosopher of water, a man who saw in rivers the mirror of existence. His notebooks overflowed with spirals and currents, but beneath those lines lay a philosophy of acceptance, of belonging, of peace. And as you rest with this thought, imagine him setting down his quill, his eyes lifting from the page to the window, where outside the rain falls softly on the valley, and know that for him, even the smallest droplet was a world of wonder. As the days at Close Loose passed with their calm rhythm of study, conversation, and reflection, Leonardo often drifted into memories of the places that had shaped him. The quiet French manor became, in his imagination, a kind of theatre of remembrance, where the cities of Florence and Milan rose before him in vivid detail. It was not nostalgia alone, though a soft melancholy touched his recollections, was also gratitude, a recognition that each city had carved a mark upon him, just as water shapes stone. He would sit by the window, a blanket across his shoulders, and speak to Francesco Melzi of those years, painting pictures not on canvas but with words, so that his pupils, too, might glimpse the streets, the faces, the brilliance, and the struggles that had formed his path. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how Florence and Milan were not merely settings in his life, but living forces, shaping his art, his science, his very soul. Florence was always his beginning, the city of his birth, though Vinci was his first home. The Arno Valley, the Tuscan hills, these landscapes gave him his first lessons in nature. But Florence gave him his apprenticeship, his introduction to workshops, to pigments, to stone and bronze. In his recollections, Leonardo often spoke of Andrea del Verrocchio's studio, where he had once been a young apprentice among many, learning to grind colors, to prepare brushes, to sketch endlessly. Picture him now, in his old age, describing to his attentive listeners the bustle of that studio, the clatter of tools, the sharp scent of heated metal, the light falling across half-finished sculptures. He may have smiled as he remembered the story, perhaps embellished, that Verrocchio, upon seeing Leonardo's angel painted in the baptism of Christ, declared he would never touch a brush again. So struck was he by the young man's talent. Whether entirely true or not, the memory reflected a truth. Florence had been the city where his gift first revealed itself to others. The city itself pulsed with energy. Merchants, artists, philosophers, mingling in streets that echoed with debate and trade. Leonardo must have remembered the markets along the Arno, the bridges spanning the river, the guilds that governed trade and art alike. Florence was not only a home of beauty but of fierce competition, where patrons expected brilliance and artists measured themselves against each other constantly. For a restless soul like Leonardo, this was both inspiring and burdensome. He painted some, studied much, but often left works unfinished, his mind always racing ahead to new ideas. Yet Florence remained in him like a heartbeat, its domes, its bells, its light shimmering across the Arno, always reminding him of beginnings. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll notice how these beginnings in Florence set the stage for his Milanese years, which would shape him in entirely new ways. Milan came later, and with it, a transformation. Invited to the court of Ludovico Sforza, Leonardo found himself in a city less dominated by rivalries of painters and more open to the blending of disciplines. In Florence, he had been one among many. In Milan, he became a court artist, engineer, and entertainer. Imagine him describing to Melzi the splendor of Sforza's court, banquets illuminated by torches, music echoing in halls, the hum of politics in every corner. Leonardo thrived in this environment because it gave him room to expand, to let his curiosity spread across fields. He designed pageants, costumes, and theatrical machines. He sketched weapons and fortifications. He planned canals and architecture. And, of course, he painted. The Last Supper belonged to Milan, painted on the wall of Santa Maria del Grazie. Leonardo might have recalled with a sigh the challenges of that work there, experiments with technique, the quick fading of pigments, but also the vision that had driven him. He had wanted not a static scene, but a living moment, the shock of Christ's words stirring each apostle differently, human emotions captured in gesture and glance. Even as age slowed him at close loose, he must have remembered standing in that refectory, paintbrush in hand, apprentices at his side, his mind alight with the challenge of translating divine mystery into human expression. Milan gave him more than patrons. It gave him time to develop his notebooks. There he filled page after page with sketches of machines, diagrams of anatomy, drawings of plants, notes in his mirrored script. He experimented with flying devices, with hydraulics, with geometry. It was in Milan that Leonardo became not just an artist, but the polymath history remembers a man who refused to divide art from science or beauty from engineering. Breathe gently and picture him at his Milanese desk, candle flickering, quill scratching steadily, his notebooks spreading outward like rivers branching into countless streams. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how these memories of Florence and Milan intertwined in his reflections. Florence had given him birth and beginnings. Milan had given him breadth and expansion. Together, they formed the core of his identity. He may have told his apprentices that Florence taught him to see beauty, but Milan taught him to apply it everywhere in machines, in structures, in designs that reached beyond painting. And yet there was always a sense of incompletion. Florence had been left too soon, Milan lost in political upheaval. He carried both cities not as finished stories, but as unfinished melodies, still resonating within him. At close loose, recounting these places allowed him to re-inhabit them. He spoke of Florence's streets at dawn, the smell of bread rising, the bells of the Duomo tolling. He spoke of Milan's canals at sunset, the water catching fire from the sky, gondolas drifting slowly, voices carrying across the evening air. His apprentices, many of them too young ever to have seen these places, must have felt transported, as if through Leonardo's words they walked the cobbles, touched the stones, breathed the scents themselves. For Leonardo, these memories were not only personal, they were teachings, showing his companions how cities shape the soul, how environment becomes part of identity. He sometimes grew wistful, speaking of works left unfinished in Florence, commissions abandoned in Milan, projects that never came to fruition. But rather than bitterness, his tone was gentle, almost amused, as if he had come to accept that incompletion was part of his story. He had been too curious, too wide-ranging, to finish everything. And perhaps, he mused, that was fitting. For a finished life is a closed life, while his had always been open, flowing, like the rivers he loved. Breathe again, and imagine him pausing in these stories, gazing into the fire, lost for a moment in silence. Then he would turn, his eyes bright despite age, and say something unexpected, perhaps, about how the arches of Florence's buildings resembled the bones of the human ribcage, or how the canals of Milan mirrored the veins of the body. He could not separate memory from metaphor. Every city became a body, every structure a lesson in nature. His listeners leaned in, warmed not just by the fire, but by the depth of his seeing. And so, at close loose, Florence and Milan lived again, not as distant places, but as present companions. They were with him in every sketch, in every lesson, in every metaphor. They reminded him of who he had been, and, more importantly, of who he still was, a man who sought to connect all things, who never stopped observing, who never ceased to wonder. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how these memories prepared him for peace, allowing him to let go of the unfinished with gratitude, to embrace the flow of life as it had come to him in this way. Leonardo's reflections on Florence and Milan were not simply recollections of the past, but affirmations of the present. They showed him that every step, even those that seemed incomplete, had been necessary, weaving together the fabric of his genius. And as he set down his quill for the evening, the fire glowing low, the Loire murmuring beyond the walls, he seemed content. For within him lived two cities, two teachers, and their lessons would ripple outward long after he was gone. At close loose, when the evenings grew long and the Loire lay quiet under silver moonlight, Leonardo sometimes spoke not of Florence or Milan, but of Rome. His voice grew softer then, for the memories were more complicated, threaded with both hope and disappointment. Rome, for him, had been a city of immense promise, a place where one might expect every door of opportunity to open. Yet it had been, in truth, a city of frustrations. Still, as he looked back from the calm of his French retreat, he no longer carried sharp bitterness. Time had softened those edges, turning his recollections into lessons, reflections, and gentle acceptance. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how Leonardo's Roman years, though often overshadowed by rivals and mischances, revealed his persistence, his dignity, and his unbroken curiosity. He had come to Rome in 1513, already in his 60s, older than many of the artists who thrived there. The city was alive with grandeur, bustling with scholars, theologians, engineers, and artists of renown. Michelangelo was at work on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, Raphael painting his luminous rooms for the papal chambers. Leonardo, though celebrated, found himself on the edges of this vibrant court, his reputation immense, yet his opportunities limited. Imagine him walking through the streets of Rome then, narrow lanes opening into piazzas, the Tiber glinting in the sunlight, churches rising at every turn, the voices of artists, merchants, and pilgrims blending into a symphony of sound. The energy must have been intoxicating, and yet, for Leonardo, it was not his stage. He received commissions, yes, but few compared to the scale of those granted to his younger rivals. Pope Leo X, son of Lorenzo de' Medici, admired him but saw in him less the fiery producer of masterpieces and more the philosopher, the dreamer. Leonardo proposed projects waterworks to drain swamps, designs for machines, studies of flight and light, but many were met with polite interest and little follow-through. To a man who had always lived on the edge of realization, the Roman years felt particularly elusive. Breathe softly and imagine him presenting a carefully drawn plan to a patron, only to see it set aside, while Michelangelo's hammer echoed in marble and Raphael's brushes spread color across walls. Still, even in disappointment, Leonardo worked. He dissected bodies in Rome, pursuing his anatomical studies with a fervor that had never waned. His notebooks from those years are filled with exquisite drawings of muscles, bones, organs, each rendered with a precision that revealed both science and art. He studied optics, experimenting with how light passed through lenses, anticipating discoveries that would only be confirmed centuries later. He sketched machines with a mind still leaping forward, even as his hands slowed. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how these quiet, often overlooked, Roman studies became treasures for the future, even if at the time they seemed to vanish into obscurity. What troubled him most, perhaps, was the rivalry. Michelangelo, stern and uncompromising, looked down on Leonardo, considering him a man of ideas more than action. Raphael, younger and more adaptable, charmed the papal court with his graceful figures. Leonardo, caught between them, seemed almost an anachronism, a giant from another era now overshadowed by new stars. Yet, rather than bristle, he withdrew inward, pouring himself into studies that required no papal approval, no grand commission. He turned to nature itself, his truest teacher, sketching, observing, writing, his notebooks expanding even as his opportunities narrowed. Breathe again, and picture him in a dim Roman chamber, candles glowing on scattered parchments, the sounds of the city outside muffled by thick stone walls. His assistants bend over sketches, copying his notes, while Leonardo, cloaked and contemplative, explains the mechanics of the heart, the movement of water, the path of the stars. To the world outside, he may have seemed idle, unproductive, even forgotten. But within those rooms, brilliance unfolded quietly, patiently, waiting for the future to catch up. Rome also deepened his sense of spirituality, though not in conventional ways. Surrounded by the grandeur of the church, Leonardo's reflections on the soul, on the harmony of creation, grew more urgent. He had long believed in a kind of universal spirit, a divine geometry that linked all things. In Rome, perhaps while gazing at ancient ruins or listening to Gregorian chants echo in stone halls, he felt both humbled and inspired. The eternal city reminded him that human works, no matter how grand, were transient, and yet the principles of nature, light, motion, proportion, endured. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how this realization helped him later, as he faced the limits of his own time. There were moments of beauty in Rome too. He would walk among the ruins, sketching columns broken but still noble, tracing the lines of aqueducts, marveling at how the ancients had moved water across miles of stone. He studied the Pantheon, its dome an echo of heaven itself, a perfect circle of sky framed in concrete. These structures stirred him deeply, proof that human ingenuity could rival nature, that form and function could unite. He must have told his apprentices in France, with a mix of admiration and longing, of those Roman monuments, encouraging them to learn from both the ancients and from nature itself. But as the years passed, Leonardo felt the limits of Rome more keenly. His patrons there offered little to satisfy his boundless curiosity. He grew weary of politics, of rivalries, of promises unmet. And so, when the invitation came from Francis I of France, it must have felt like release. He left Rome in 1516, carrying with him his beloved paintings, the Mona Lisa, the Saint John the Baptist, the Virgin and Child with Saint Anand, countless notebooks. He may have felt sorrow to leave Italy, his homeland, but he must also have felt relief, for Rome had been a cage to his restless mind. Looking back from close loose, Leonardo did not speak of Rome with anger. Instead, he spoke of it as one speaks of a stern teacher, demanding, unyielding, but ultimately instructive. Rome had shown him the limits of patronage, the fragility of fame, the inevitability of being eclipsed. Yet it had also given him time, ironically, to turn inward, to focus on studies that mattered more than commissions. It had reminded him that art and science are not validated by applause, but by truth. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how this gentleness in recollection revealed Leonardo's true wisdom, the ability to turn disappointment into acceptance, to find peace in unfinished work. And so, in the evenings at Close Loose, when apprentices leaned close to hear his words, Leonardo would recall Rome not as failure, but as part of his flow, one more bend in the river of his life. Florence had given him beginnings, Milan expansion, and Rome had given him reflection. Each city had played its role, each had left its mark, and together they formed the mosaic of his genius. As he folded his hands in his lap, the firelight flickering, he seemed at peace. The disappointments of Rome transmuted into quiet wisdom, like rough stone polished smooth by water. In the gentle hush of Close Loose, one figure stood closer to Leonardo than any other: Francesco Melzi. While many apprentices had come and gone, while patrons had praised and then forgotten, Melzi remained by his side with devotion as steady as the Loire's flowing current. Their bond was more than that of master and pupil. It was a relationship woven of trust, loyalty, and quiet affection. For in Melzi, Leonardo found not only a companion to share his last years, but also a guardian of his legacy, someone who would carry the flame of his mind into the world beyond his own life. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how the story of Leonardo cannot be told without Melzi, the faithful disciple who listened, learned, and preserved what otherwise might have been lost. Francesco Melzi came to Leonardo as a young man of noble birth from Lombardy. He had met the master in Milan, and, unlike other apprentices driven by ambition or the promise of fame, Melzi seemed drawn simply by admiration and love of learning. Leonardo, ever sensitive to sincerity, recognized in him a spirit of patience and humility. At Close Loose, Melzi became not merely an assistant but a constant presence, organizing notes, preparing pigments, managing correspondence, and gently caring for his aging teacher. Breathe softly, and imagine him in the candlelit study, sorting sheaves of parchment into careful piles, while Leonardo dictated thoughts too important to be left unwritten. Their voices would rise and fall in a rhythm as natural as rain, one questioning, the other recording, both aware of the weight of these final lessons. Melzi's devotion showed itself in the smallest acts. He guided Leonardo through the gardens when walking grew difficult. He ensured meals were ready, that the fire was always warm, that quills were trimmed and inkpots filled. He shielded him from unnecessary interruptions, allowing the master's dwindling energy to remain focused on thought. Yet Melzi was not only caretaker, he was student. He absorbed Leonardo's philosophy, his habit of observation, his refusal to separate art from science. Leonardo trusted him as he trusted few, knowing that in Melzi, his ideas would not only survive, but be cherished. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how this trust shaped the destiny of Leonardo's notebooks. Those sprawling manuscripts that might otherwise have scattered like leaves in the wind. For when Leonardo spoke of legacy, it was to Melzi that he turned. He entrusted his vast collection of writings and drawings to this young man, instructing him to preserve them, to organize them, to protect them from neglect. Imagine the responsibility Melzi must have felt. Thousands of pages filled with mirrored script, diagrams of inventions, anatomical studies, reflections on nature and philosophy. To hold them was to hold the mind of Leonardo itself, fragile and precious. And yet Melzi accepted this task with grace, promising to honor it. Breathe again and picture him cradling those bundles of paper, aware that they carried within them not only knowledge, but also the voice of the man he revered. Their conversations often drifted into personal reflection. Leonardo, nearing the end, would share memories of his early sketches in Vinci, of Verrocchio's studio, of the court of Milan, of struggles in Rome. Melzi listened not only as a pupil, but as a son might listen to a father, cherishing each word, each pause. At times, Leonardo's tone was wistful, regretting works left unfinished. At others, he grew animated, recalling discoveries, marvels, and dreams. And Melzi, with patience, absorbed it all, storing not only the words, but the cadence, the mood, the very presence of the master. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll realize that through Melzi's memory, Leonardo's spirit lived on far more vividly than through any marble monument or painted portrait. Evenings at close, Luce often found the two of them seated near the fire, the apprentices nearby but silent, watching the intimacy of master and disciple. Leonardo, his white beard glowing in the firelight, would lean forward, speaking softly, and Melzi would nod, respond, or ask gentle questions that drew forth more. Their bond was palpable, a current of understanding that needed no elaborate words. For Leonardo, who had known both admiration and betrayal in his life, Melzi's steadfastness was a balm. In this young man, he saw not competition, not expectation, but devotion. In Melzi, he saw a mirror of what he had hoped to inspire, a mind eager to learn, a heart eager to serve knowledge itself. Breathe slowly, and imagine a particular evening. The fire crackles, rain taps on the windows, the Loire murmurs beyond. Leonardo speaks of how rivers resemble veins, how storms mirror tempests in the human soul. Melzi, quill in hand, writes quickly, his script neat, his attention unwavering. Outside, the world sleeps, but in this room, ideas pass from one soul to another, bridging generations. The warmth of the fire glows not only in the hearth, but in the continuity of thought, in the assurance that these ideas will not die when the voice that utters them falls silent. Melzi's devotion extended beyond duty into love. He mourned the limitations of his master's health, yet he never treated him as diminished. To him, Leonardo remained always the great mind, the mentor, the inspiration. When Leonardo faltered, Melzi steadied him with quiet dignity. When Leonardo doubted, Melzi reassured him. When Leonardo grew weary, Melzi carried the weight. Their relationship, though never loudly proclaimed, was one of the most profound of Leonardo's life. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how this bond shaped the very survival of Leonardo's genius for centuries to come. After Leonardo's death in 1519, it was Melzi who gathered the manuscripts, who carried them back to Italy, who fought to keep them safe. Others sought to claim them, to scatter them, to use them for their own gain. But Melzi resisted, guarding them for decades, understanding their value even when others did not. Without his care, much might have been lost. Through him, the notebooks endured, passing eventually into the hands of collectors, libraries, and scholars, ensuring that Leonardo's voice would still be heard. Imagine him, now older, opening the worn pages, hearing again the echo of his master's voice, remembering the evenings at Close Loose when those words had first been spoken. And so, when we think of Leonardo, we must also think of Melzi, the quiet custodian, the faithful student, the one who turned loyalty into legacy. Their bond reminds us that genius does not exist in isolation. It flows through relationships, through trust, through those who listen and preserve. Leonardo gave the world ideas. Melzi ensured the world received them. Together, they formed a partnership that extended beyond life into history. Breathe one more time, and picture them in their final days together. Leonardo seated in his chamber, Melzi by his side, the air filled with the scent of ink and parchment, the fire casting gentle light. Outside, the Loire moves endlessly toward the sea. Inside, two souls share silence, words, and trust, and know that in this bond, quiet and steady, lay the assurance that Leonardo's story would not fade but continue, carried gently forward by the hands of love. In the late evenings at Close Loose, when the halls had grown quiet and the Loire beyond the gardens whispered softly in the dark, Leonardo would gather his apprentices for what he called his last lessons. These were not formal lectures, not organized as a teacher might plan, but gentle conversations, sometimes beginning with the simplest of observations, the way a flame leaned in a draught, or how the moonlight fell unevenly across the floor. The apprentices would sit close, the fire casting amber shadows on the walls, and Leonardo, his voice low and calm, would speak of art, science, nature, and memory. These teachings were fragments, unfinished thoughts, yet each glowed with the warmth of wisdom distilled through a lifetime of restless observation. And perhaps that is why they lingered in the hearts of those who listened, because they carried not only knowledge, but the tenderness of a man aware that his time was drawing short. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll see how these unfinished teachings carried as much power as his completed works, inviting us to find beauty not only in masterpieces but in the sketches left behind. Leonardo would begin with the matter closest to his heart, the unity of nature. He reminded them that to draw a leaf truly was to understand the branching of rivers, the spreading of lightning, the branching of veins in the body. All things, he whispered, speak with the same language. He encouraged them never to separate the study of art from the study of life, never to believe that a painting was only pigment on wood. Look closer, he would say, lifting a fragile hand toward the flame, and you will see that the play of light on this fire is no different from the shimmer of sunlight on water. To paint one well, you must understand the other. The apprentices, leaning in, felt as though the walls themselves breathed with meaning, as though ordinary observations could open into endless connections. Often his thoughts turned to unfinished work, The Mona Lisa sat still with him in memory, though the panel itself remained incomplete in detail, layers unpolished, mysteries unresolved. A painting is never finished, he murmured once, the candlelight trembling in his eyes, only abandoned when time insists upon it. He confessed that many of his commissions had been left in this state not through neglect, but because he felt the work still alive, still growing, never reaching a point of true completion. To him, the notion of finality was a fiction. Life itself was always becoming, never static. And so he urged his students to accept the beauty of incompleteness, to recognize that a sketch, though unpolished, contained a spark as true as a finished fresco. Breathe softly now, for in these words lies a comfort we too can hold, that we ourselves, like his works, are always unfolding, always in motion, and never bound by a single finished form. Sometimes he returned to the subject of anatomy, recalling nights in Florence when he had studied the hidden structures of the human body. His apprentices would listen in hushed awe as he described the marvel of the heart, the folding of lungs, the architecture of muscles. But he spoke not with clinical detachment, rather with reverence. The body, he whispered, is the dwelling place of the soul, crafted with care by nature's hand. To draw it poorly is to dishonor its design. He pressed them to approach anatomy not as dissection alone, but as devotion, to sketch each tendon and vessel as though drawing a sacred cathedral. His notebooks, filled with thousands of such studies, lay in stacks nearby, each page crowded with diagrams, notes, mirrored script. They were his unfinished gospel, passed quietly from one mind to another in that dimly lit room. On other nights, his lessons turned to inventions, flying machines, bridges, hydraulic devices. Many of these designs had never left the page, yet Leonardo shared them as though they were old friends. Perhaps they will never fly, he admitted once, with a half smile. But perhaps you will find in them the seed of something future generations may make real. He encouraged them to imagine without fear, to draw not only what was possible, but what might one day be. Sketch it anyway, he would insist, his eyes glimmering. The future may recognize what the present cannot. His apprentices felt their minds expand with this permission to dream beyond the limits of their time, to plant ideas like seeds that might bloom centuries hence. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how this encouragement became one of his most enduring gifts. A quiet push toward imagination without end. At times his words carried a gentler, almost parental tone. He reminded them to live kindly, to care for the small creatures of the world. He spoke of birds whose wings he had studied, of plants whose growth he had drawn, of the simple dignity of a flowing river. Treat the world gently, he said, for it is your teacher as much as I am. These were lessons not found in contracts or commissions, but in daily habits of observation and care. His apprentices, often young and eager for glory, felt themselves softened by these reminders, reminded that true mastery came not from recognition, but from reverence for life itself. When fatigue overtook him, Leonardo would lean back, his voice trailing into silence. Melzi, ever close, would take over, reading aloud from Leonardo's earlier notes, ensuring that the rhythm of thought never faltered. The apprentices would continue listening, warmed by the fire, lulled by the cadence of words, and in that moment, the boundaries between master, pupil, and text blurred. They were simply a circle of minds sharing one stream of wisdom, like hands dipping together into the same river. There were also reflections on failure. Leonardo admitted openly that many of his projects had faltered: statues never cast, machines never built, paintings never finished. But rather than shame, he offered them as examples of freedom. "Do not fear failure," he whispered, his breath faint yet steady. "It is proof that you attempted what others would not dare. Better an unfinished dream than no dream at all." His pupils, hearing this, felt a release in their own hearts, a loosening of the burden to be perfect. In his vulnerability, Leonardo gave them courage, showing that greatness lay not in perfection but in persistence, in curiosity that never died. Breathe again, gently, and imagine those candlelit gatherings, the scratching of quill on parchment, the murmured responses of apprentices, the fire flickering against shelves of manuscripts. Outside, the French night stretched endlessly, cool air drifting through shutters, the scent of earth and river blending with wax and ink. Inside, wisdom lingered like incense, soft and pervasive. Each word, each silence, carried weight, weaving into the apprentices' minds a fabric that would long outlast the walls of clothes loose in one of his final lessons. Leonardo reflected on time. "We measure hours with clocks," he said softly, "yet true time is measured in what we observe and what we create. A day spent in wonder is longer than a year spent in neglect." He urged them not to chase after years, but to fill each moment with attention, to treat each observation as valuable, to waste nothing of the world's detail. It was his last exhortation, to live deeply, attentively, as though every day were itself a work of art. And as the apprentices rose each evening, bowing quietly, they felt not sadness but gratitude. They carried with them not only knowledge but a sense of peace, a calm assurance that to follow their curiosity was enough. Leonardo, with his fading strength, had given them what might be his greatest gift, the permission to live as learners, unhurried, observant, compassionate. So when we think of Leonardo's final teachings, we should not imagine grand lectures or solemn pronouncements, but rather these quiet evenings at close, loose candles glowing, voices low, unfinished thoughts floating like sparks from a fire. His words were fragments, yet they formed a whole. His works were unfinished, yet they were complete in their essence. His life was ending, yet his legacy was just beginning, carried in the hearts of those who had sat with him in those last tender nights. Stay with me, and rest in the comfort of knowing this, that even as he left so much unfinished, Leonardo left behind enough to keep wonder alive for centuries. And perhaps that is the truest measure of his genius, that he taught not only through what he completed, but through what he allowed others to continue. The spring of 1519 unfolded gently in the Loire Valley, with the air carrying the scent of blossoms and the steady hum of bees drifting between gardens and orchards. Inside, closed loose, Leonardo da Vinci, now in his late 60s, felt time as a companion rather than an enemy. His body had grown frail, his hand sometimes trembled, and walking across the tiled floors required support, yet his mind still reached outward, still attentive to details, still restless in curiosity. He had lived through wars, commissions, courtly intrigues, and grand projects, yet here, in the quiet refuge granted by King Francis I, he found something unexpected: peace. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll see how his reflections on mortality were not dark or fearful, but luminous, filled with the same wonder that had colored his notebooks since boyhood. Leonardo spent long hours by the window of his chamber, watching the movement of clouds. He described them still, with whispered words or faint sketches, noting how their shapes shifted like thoughts. To watch a cloud is to watch the world change, he murmured to Melzi one afternoon, and to watch the world change is to watch oneself. He was not afraid of the change he felt within his own body. He treated it as another natural process, another phenomenon to observe with calm attention. For Leonardo, mortality was not an interruption but a continuation of nature's design. Just as he had studied the veins in leaves, the branching of rivers, the muscles of animals, he now studied the approach of his own end as part of the great order he had always sought to understand. He took comfort in the companionship of Melzi, who remained always near, gentle and loyal. The young man brought him ink, tended to his manuscripts, and read to him in the evenings. Leonardo sometimes apologized for his weakness, for the burden he feared he had become. But Melzi would shake his head with quiet affection. "You are not a burden," he said once, placing a fresh sheet of parchment before his master. "You are a gift." Those words lingered, warming Leonardo like sunlight through an open shutter. They reminded him that legacy was not only in works of art or machines sketched in notebooks, but in the love and respect one left in the hearts of others. Each day Leonardo tried to walk the gardens, leaning on Melzi's arm. The Loire Valley stretched out before him with its vineyards, its soft hills, its river winding like a silver thread. The scents of rosemary and lavender floated from the beds, mingling with the sweetness of blooming fruit trees. The world seemed abundant, almost overflowing, and Leonardo felt himself part of it, neither separate nor diminished by age. He would pause by a small stream, pointing to the play of light on water, and whisper, "See how it bends around the stones. My hand bends around its weakness in the same way. It flows, and so do I." In those moments, mortality was no longer a shadow, but a gentle teacher reminding him of continuity, of the circle that always returns. Sometimes his thoughts drifted backward, to Florence, to Milan, to Rome. He remembered his first sketches of machines, his hours studying anatomy by candlelight, the smell of plaster in unfinished frescoes, the clamor of workshops. He smiled at the memory of horses, at his fascination with their power and grace. He thought of faces, patrons, apprentices, friends, some long gone, others lingering in memory like faint outlines on a page. And always the image of his father's village, Vinci, returned. The hills, the olive groves, the boy he had once been, carrying charcoal to draw the flight of birds. From Vinci to Ambience, he whispered to himself, and all the spaces between, the journey has been enough. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how even in these late reflections, Leonardo's curiosity burned. He dictated notes on the movement of water, on geometry, on light. He returned to his pages with diagrams of bridges, sketches of imagined cities, ideas for flying machines. He knew he would never build them, never see them realized, yet he pressed on, as though to stop imagining would be to stop breathing. Creation itself was his breath. Even as he approached the end, he filled his days with beginnings, and perhaps that is why his notebooks, though unfinished, carry such resonance. They are reminders that the act of wondering need not end. At times, Francis I visited close loose, walking with Leonardo in the gardens or sitting beside him indoors. The king, young and eager, admired Leonardo not only as an artist, but as a sage. It is said Francis called him my father, a mark of reverence that brought tears to Leonardo's eyes. To be honored not for one painting, not for one machine, but for the fullness of his spirit, This was a gift greater than titles or riches. When the king asked him for advice on governance, on philosophy, on the nature of man, Leonardo answered with gentleness, "Rule as nature rules, with balance, with patience, with regard for growth." Such counsel, soft and measured, reflected not ambition but wisdom shaped by decades of careful seeing. Evenings grew quieter as the spring advanced. Leonardo's strength waned, yet he cherished the rhythm of simple things, the lighting of a candle, the turning of a page, the voices of apprentices in distant halls. He found beauty in slowness. "The world rushes," he told Melzi one night, "but the truth waits. I am learning to wait with it." These words, spoken with a faint smile, reflected a serenity that had replaced his earlier urgency. In youth, he had raced after knowledge. In age, he allowed knowledge to come to him, like birds alighting of their own accord. As April gave way to May, Leonardo seemed to sense the nearness of his passing. He grew tender, often thanking those around him for the smallest gestures: cup of water, a blanket placed across his knees. Gratitude filled him, not regret. "I have offended nature and men," he confessed quietly, "for my work did not reach the height it might have." Yet Melzi, hearing this, shook his head firmly. "You have given us enough," he whispered. And perhaps Leonardo himself knew this, though humility prevented him from claiming it. His notebooks lay stacked by his bed, his sketches filling drawers, his paintings scattered across Europe, his thoughts alive in the minds of those who had learned from him. "Enough, indeed. Breathe slowly with me, and picture his final nights. The chamber lit by soft candles, the shutters closed against the cool night air, the scent of beeswax mingling with ink. Leonardo rests, his hands folded, his eyes half closed, but still alert, still curious, as if studying the shifting glow on the ceiling. He whispers to Melzi of rivers, of stars, of the flight of birds, his favorite metaphors never far from him. The room is calm, safe, unhurried, and time itself seems to bend around the bed, pausing out of respect. On May 2nd, 1519, Leonardo's life came gently to its close. Accounts say he died in the arms of Francis I, though others record only that Melzi was by his side. However it happened, the essence remains the same. His passing was not marked by fear, but by tenderness, surrounded by those who loved him in a place of peace. His last breath was soft, like the turning of a page, the end of a long story whose meaning lay not only in the conclusion, but in every line along the way. After his death, Melzi took responsibility for his manuscripts, guarding them with devotion. He mourned not only the man, but the endless curiosity that had filled each day. Yet even in sorrow, he recognized what Leonardo had always taught, that nothing is ever truly finished, and that his master's work would continue through others. The notebooks, the sketches, the fragments were seeds scattered across time, destined to bloom in centuries to come. And so, Leonardo's reflections on mortality were fulfilled in the way he lived until the end, with curiosity, with gratitude, with humility. He saw death not as a wall, but as another threshold, part of the great design he had spent his life observing. For those of us who listen now, centuries later, his example remains, that we may approach our days with wonder, that we may accept incompleteness as beauty, and that when our own time comes, we may look at the sky, the water, the flight of a bird, and feel ourselves part of something eternal. Rest easy in this thought. Leonardo da Vinci's final days, at close loose, were not filled with despair, but with peace. not with emptiness, but with abundance. He had lived as he had drawn, with eyes wide open, with hands reaching, with heart attentive. His story continues in every quiet act of observation we allow ourselves, in every question we whisper into the night. And now, softly, we will cross into the next chapter, carrying with us the calm of Leonardo's last reflections. When word of Leonardo da Vinci's passing spread beyond the walls of Close Loose, it drifted like a gentle echo across Europe, softened by distance, yet carrying with it a weight of meaning. In Amboise, the people spoke of the strange Italian sage who had walked their gardens, the one whose gaze seemed always to linger longer than others, as though he saw more than met the eye. For Francis I, it was the loss of a friend as well as an advisor, a man whose presence had lent wisdom and quiet dignity to his court. In Italy, the news travelled more slowly, carried by letters and travellers. Florence remembered its lost son. Milan thought of the court painter who had once shaped its identity. Rome, with its endless intrigues, marked his absence as another shift in the tide of influence. Yet for those closest to him, the immediate legacy was not in monuments or pronouncements, but in the delicate task of gathering the fragments he had left behind. Stay with me, for in a moment we'll see how this dispersal of his works became as much a story of preservation as of loss. Each page of his notebooks, like a candle, passed carefully through the hands of history, at Close Loose. Francesco Melzi became the guardian of Leonardo's memory. Devoted beyond measure, he took upon himself the responsibility of caring for the vast collection of manuscripts, drawings, and notes his master had accumulated. The task was staggering. Piles of notebooks lay stacked in chests, filled with mirrored script, crowded sketches of anatomy, engineering, flight, hydraulics, and art. Loose sheets carried designs for machines, studies of plants, observations of weather, and philosophical musings. To others, this might have appeared a confusing chaos, the restless scribblings of a mind that refused to settle. But Melzi knew their worth. He recognized in those tangled pages the essence of Leonardo, not order imposed, but curiosity unbounded. He promised himself to preserve them even as he grieved. The dispersal of Leonardo's works, however, was neither neat nor complete. Melzi cared for them faithfully, but over time, as years passed, portions drifted into other hands. Some were gifted, others borrowed and never returned. A few were sold when Melzi's heirs lacked the same devotion. Thus the legacy scattered like seeds carried by the wind, waiting to germinate across centuries. Some pages found their way to England, where they would inspire engineers and scientists long after Leonardo's time. Others remained hidden in private collections, discovered only by chance in later centuries. Even in their fragmentation, the notebooks carried a strange kind of immortality, pieces of a life unfinished, yet capable of sparking new beginnings in minds far removed from his own. Meanwhile, the paintings he left behind began their own journeys. The Mona Lisa remained in France, treasured by the king who had welcomed Leonardo into his court. Other works, such as the Last Supper, endured in Milan, though already weathered by time and experiment. Each piece bore not only the marks of Leonardo's genius, but also the traces of his humanity, his tendency to revise endlessly, his reluctance to declare a work finished, his experiments with technique that sometimes failed even as they revealed new possibilities. Europe received these works not as relics frozen in perfection, but as living presences, whispers of a man whose touch remained visible in every brushstroke, every line. Stay with me. because in a moment you'll see how this dispersal was not only material but spiritual. The apprentices who had gathered at close loose carried Leonardo's teachings in their hearts. Melzi, most of all, embodied his master's spirit, continuing to study, to draw, to reflect in ways shaped by years of gentle mentorship. Others returned to Italy, carrying with them fragments of wisdom, anecdotes, sketches copied from the master's hand. They spread his ideas in quiet ways, through influence rather than proclamation, through whispers rather than trumpets. Leonardo had never sought to found a school, had never gathered disciples in the formal sense, but through his openness, he left behind a lineage of minds trained to observe, to wonder, to connect. Francis I, eager to honor the memory of his beloved guest, ensured that Leonardo's name was spoken with reverence at court. He described him as the greatest painter of his time, though he knew well that painting was but a fragment of his genius. The king ordered that Leonardo be buried in Ambience, his resting place not far from the chateau where they had walked together in conversation. Whether or not the exact tomb remains today is uncertain. The centuries have blurred its trace, but the gesture itself was one of affection, a sign that Leonardo was not merely a foreign guest, but woven into the fabric of France. For those who remembered him personally, the immediate legacy was quieter still. They recalled his gentle manner, his fondness for animals, his tendency to pause mid-step, to notice something others overlooked. They remembered evenings at Close Loose when his voice filled the firelit room with fragments of wisdom. These memories became part of his legacy just as much as paintings and manuscripts. In truth, his life left an impression not only on the canvas of history but also on the softer, more fleeting canvas of human hearts. Over the years, as his work spread across Europe, something curious happened. The myth of Leonardo grew even as the details faded. Many had never met him, yet they spoke of him as a figure larger than life, an embodiment of the Renaissance itself. Stories circulated of his inventions, some exaggerated, others rooted in truth. He became a symbol of boundless curiosity, of the marriage of art and science, of the human capacity to dream. In this way, even as his physical presence disappeared, his spirit expanded, becoming part of the collective imagination of generations. And yet, if Leonardo himself could have witnessed this legacy, he might have smiled with humility, perhaps even with irony, for he never considered himself complete, never felt satisfied with his achievements. To him, life was a sketchbook always in progress, lines overlapping, erasures showing, ideas spilling into one another. That such a life could inspire awe centuries later would have surprised him. But perhaps that is why his influence endures, because it is not the legacy of perfection, but the legacy of persistence, of endless curiosity. Breathe softly now, and imagine the Loire Valley after his passing. The river flows on, indifferent yet eternal. The gardens of Close Loose bloom in spring, their colors bright, their fragrances sweet. Melzi walks the halls, his heart heavy but his resolve strong, carrying bundles of notebooks from room to room, carefully preserving them. The candles burn low in Leonardo's chamber, but outside, the world he loved continues in motion, the birds in flight, the play of light on water, the patterns of clouds. His spirit lingers in these details, in the ordinary marvels he taught others to notice. The immediate legacy of Leonardo da Vinci was thus twofold: tangible in his works, scattered but enduring, and intangible in the habits of seeing he instilled in those around him. His dispersal was not a loss, but a transformation, a scattering of seeds, across time and space. Centuries later, those seeds would bloom into discoveries, inspirations, and renewed wonder. But in the quiet months after his death, they were carried gently by the hands of friends, apprentices, and admirers who recognized that even unfinished, even scattered, Leonardo's work was enough to keep curiosity alive. Rest with me in this thought, that the measure of a life is not in how neatly it concludes, but in how deeply it continues to stir others long after. Leonardo's story, though it ended at close loose, was already moving outward, beginning again in countless minds across Europe. And now, softly, we will turn to the next chapter, where the long afterlife of his legacy, the centuries of rediscovery and reverence unfolds with quiet persistence, as though he still whispers from the pages of his notebooks. In the centuries after Leonardo's passing, his presence seemed at once everywhere and nowhere. His name was remembered, whispered with awe in the courts of Europe, yet his true genius lay scattered across notebooks tucked away in chests, forgotten on shelves, or guarded in private libraries. His paintings, though few, began their own journeys, some to prominence, others to obscurity. The Mona Lisa, resting quietly in France, would one day become the most recognized face in the world. But for generations, it was simply another treasure of a royal collection. The Last Supper, fading even in his lifetime, became a ruin admired more for its daring conception than its preservation. Yet the heart of his legacy, the restless sketches, the diagrams of flight and water, the observations of plants and anatomies leapt in fragments, waiting for rediscovery. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll see how this slow unearthing became its own story, one that stretched across centuries, shaping how the world came to understand Leonardo not merely as a painter, but as a mind without borders. Francesco Melzi, faithful until his own death, kept Leonardo's manuscripts intact as best he could. He recognized them as the truest expression of his master's soul. Though others at the time often valued paintings over scribbled notes, when Melzi passed, however, the precious collection began to scatter. Some heirs lacked the devotion, others failed to understand their significance. Sheets were sold, given away, or lost. A page that once lay beside another could find itself a continent away within a generation. It was not malice, but indifference, the quiet erosion of time. And yet, though scattered, they endured. Each piece, no matter how small, carried with it the pulse of Leonardo's thought, waiting to inspire someone new by the 17th century. Collectors in England, Spain, and Italy began to acquire portions of his notebooks. Some prized them as curiosities, others as treasures of art, still others as puzzles of science. In England, certain pages would find their way into the hands of the Earl of Arundel, and later into the royal collection, where they would sleep again for centuries before being rediscovered. In Milan, parts of the Codex Atlanticus remained, vast and sprawling, bound into volumes by careful hands, though still not fully understood. These codices, Atlanticus, Leicester, Foster, Madrid, Windsor, each became their own chapter in the dispersal of Leonardo's thought, scattered seeds in the soil of history. What is striking is how long it took for the world to see the fullness of Leonardo. For generations he was remembered primarily as a painter, one of the masters of the Renaissance. His inventions, his studies of anatomy, his visions of flight, these remained hidden, whispered, or dismissed. It was only in the 19th and 20th centuries, when scholars finally gathered and studied his notebooks anew, that the breadth of his genius became apparent. Imagine that, for 300 years, The world held in its possession fragments of Leonardo's mind, yet had not unfolded their meaning. It was as though his legacy, like a seed, required centuries of rest before blooming again. Stay with me, because in a moment you'll see how this slowness was itself part of the story. Leonardo's restless sketches were not intended for an audience. They were companions to his curiosity, mirrors of his thought. That they remained hidden meant they remained pure, untouched by the expectations of his time. When rediscovered, they appeared startlingly modern, as though he had leaped forward in centuries, speaking directly to engineers, artists, and dreamers of a new age. His notes on flight echoed in the era of aviation. His hydraulic studies whispered to engineers shaping canals and dams. His anatomical sketches astonished physicians with their precision. What had once been fragments became bridges, spanning centuries, joining past to future. Even the gaps, the missing volumes, the lost pages, became part of the fascination. Scholars hunted for them in archives, collectors guarded them in vaults, and every rediscovery was treated like a revelation. Imagine the wonder of opening a forgotten chest and finding inside Leonardo's mirrored handwriting, his sketches of wings, his diagrams of machines. Such moments rekindled not only admiration but intimacy, as though Leonardo himself had reached across time to whisper again. His legacy became not a monument standing immovable, but a trail of discoveries, each new page adding another glimmer to the constellation of his mind. Meanwhile, his paintings gathered layers of meaning with each passing generation. The Mona Lisa, once valued but not exalted, grew slowly in reputation until she became a symbol of mystery itself. Visitors stood before her, captivated by the faint smile, the depth of her gaze. Some saw serenity, others sorrow, others joy. Each viewer projected something different, and in that endless variability, Leonardo's mastery shone. For centuries, her eyes seemed to follow people across the room, whispering a quiet reminder of the master's touch. The Last Supper, fragile on the convent wall in Milan, became a pilgrimage for those who wished to see genius even in ruin. Frescoes, sketches, portraits, and inventions all began to interweave into a larger image of Leonardo, not only as an artist, but as a thinker who could not separate beauty from knowledge. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as Europe turned towards science and industry, Leonardo's notebooks seemed prophetic. Engineers marveled at his designs for gears, cranes, and bridges. Naturalists admired his studies of plants and water. Artists found in his sketches a freedom of line, a sense of movement that felt alive. Romantic poets spoke of him as a figure ahead of his time, a genius misunderstood by his own age. Slowly, a myth grew. Leonardo not only as a man of the Renaissance, but as the embodiment of human potential itself. His life, unfinished as it was, became a canvas onto which future generations painted their own aspirations. Breathe with me now, slowly, and picture the journey of a single notebook. From Leonardo's desk it closed loose. It travels with Melzi to Milan, then to heirs who set it aside. Centuries later, it finds its way to a collector in Spain, then rests forgotten in a library, dust gathering on its cover. Decades pass, wars shift borders, generations come and go. Then one day, a scholar opens it, turning the pages, and there Leonardo's handwriting, his sketches alive once more. Imagine the hush of that discovery, the thrill of touching a page once touched by his hand. This is how his legacy lived, not in monuments that never moved, but in rediscoveries that rekindled wonder again and again in truth. The centuries after his death did not diminish Leonardo, but enlarged him. Each rediscovery, each reinterpretation, added new layers. The scientist saw in him a fellow scientist, the artist an artist, the engineer an engineer, the dreamer a dreamer. He became a mirror in which humanity could see its own aspirations reflected. That is why, perhaps, he remains so compelling, because he was not only one thing, not only painter, not only inventor, not only philosopher, but all of these woven together, a tapestry of curiosity. And so, by the time the modern world arrived, Leonardo had become more than a historical figure. He had become a symbol of what it means to wonder, to reach, to observe without boundaries. His notebooks, scattered though they were, became treasures of museums and libraries, studied and celebrated. His paintings drew millions. His sketches inspired artists and engineers alike. His myth grew larger, but at its heart remained something simple. A boy in Tuscany, watching the flight of birds, sketching with charcoal, never ceasing to ask why. Rest in this thought. The centuries after Leonardo's death were not years of silence, but years of slow unfolding. His legacy was never static. It moved like water, like light, like thought itself, flowing into new places, new minds. And even now, centuries later, we sit together in the quiet, listening to his story, and in doing so, we become part of that same unfolding, carrying his questions forward into our own time. And now, softly, we will step into the final chapter, where we draw together the strands of his life and legacy, letting them taper into the calm of a closing night. The story of Leonardo da Vinci, after centuries of wandering through fragments and rediscoveries, now comes to rest with us in this quiet moment. As you breathe slowly, imagine again the candlelit chamber at Close Loose, the Loire Valley beyond, the notebooks stacked at his side. He is gone, yet not gone at all, for every question he asked still lingers in the air. Every sketch still murmurs of possibility. Every painting still gazes back with the warmth of human mystery. In this final chapter, we do not recount his works as separate accomplishments, but gather them as threads in a larger tapestry, one that invites us to rest in wonder. Stay with me, for in a moment you'll see how Leonardo's legacy is not simply a record of the past, but a lullaby for the present, an invitation to let curiosity itself become a kind of peace. Leonardo's life was filled with beginnings. He began paintings and left them unfinished. He began machines that never flew, sculptures never cast, projects never concluded. To some, this might seem failure, but to Leonardo, and perhaps to us, if we listen carefully, this was proof of a life lived in constant unfolding. His genius was not bound by completion, but expressed through the act of searching. In this sense, his story becomes a comfort. We too are unfinished, and that is not a flaw, but a beauty. To rest tonight with Leonardo's story is to remember that it is enough to begin, enough to wonder, enough to let curiosity guide us gently forward. Imagine the notebooks, again thousands of pages filled with mirrored script and restless sketches. They lie open before us, and though the words are centuries old, they breathe as though written only yesterday. Here are studies of birds in flight, here diagrams of bridges, here muscles sketched with reverence, here water swirling in eddies. Each page hums with attention, as though the world itself were whispering into Leonardo's ear. To look upon them is to feel the soft reassurance that the smallest observations matter, the curl of a leaf, the flicker of flame, the ripple of a river. These details, collected patiently, remind us that life is not measured in grand gestures alone, but in noticing, again and again, the ordinary miracles that surround us as centuries unfolded. Leonardo became more than man, more than master. He became symbol. Artists saw in him the ideal of creativity without boundaries. Scientists saw in him the birth of modern inquiry. Philosophers saw in him the union of thought and beauty. Engineers found seeds of possibility. Dreamers found companionship. Yet beneath all of this grandeur lies something simpler, more intimate, the boy from Vinci who never stopped looking at the sky. His greatness is not in being unreachable, but in being so deeply human, curious, imperfect, tender, restless. To hold that image is to hold comfort, for it tells us we need not be complete to matter. Stay with me, because in a moment we'll let this thought sink deeper. Leonardo's story is not only about him, but about us. When we pause to watch a cloud, we echo his gaze. When we sketch idly on a page, we echo his restlessness. When we marvel at the way water bends around a stone, we echo his wonder. In this way, his legacy is alive, not in museums or libraries alone, but in the quiet habits of noticing that each of us carries. To rest with him tonight is to join in that continuity, to become part of a lineage of wonder stretching across centuries. Picture the Loire Valley at dusk. The river flows as it did in Leonardo's time. Vineyards ripple in the breeze. Stone villages glow with lanterns. Above, the same constellations shine, unchanged. Time has passed, yet the world holds the same details that once filled his notebooks. This continuity, soft and steady, reminds us that life is not a series of sharp endings, but a flowing river. Leonardo stepped into that river, observed its currents, and then stepped out. But the river itself goes on. We too are in its flow, part of its gentle motion, carried toward futures we cannot yet see. There is reassurance in this, a calm reminder that nothing is truly lost, only transformed. Even his unfinished works, the paintings that lingered incomplete, the inventions never built, hold value in their incompleteness. They invite us to imagine, to complete them in our minds, to carry them forward. Perhaps this is the final gift of Leonardo, not the things he finished, but the questions he left open, the invitations he extended without closing them. His life was a doorway left ajar, through which countless others have walked. And so tonight, as you rest, think not of endings, but of doorways, of openings, of paths still untraveled. Breathe gently and let your mind wander as it once did. Imagine a bird lifting into flight, its wings cutting the air. Imagine water cascading down a stone fountain. Imagine the play of light on a familiar face. These were the images that filled Leonardo's days, and they can fill ours too, bringing us peace not through answers but through attentiveness. In this, he becomes less a distant figure of history and more a quiet companion, sitting beside us, sketchbook open, watching the same world unfold as his story tapers. We return to the chamber at close loose one final time. The candles burn low, the shutters are closed against the night, the air is still. Leonardo lies resting, his breath slow, his mind no longer racing with endless projects, but settled into calm. Beside him, Melzi keeps watch, tender and loyal. Outside, the night deepens, stars wheel silently overhead, the river whispers on. In this stillness, we feel not loss, but peace. The great artist, the restless thinker, the gentle observer, his work is not finished, but it is enough. His presence remains, not only in the works he left, but in the spirit of curiosity he shared with the world. And so, we come to the close of his story. Leonardo da Vinci, child of Vinci, painter of Florence and Milan, guest of France, dreamer of the impossible, rests. Yet his questions remain awake, carried forward by centuries, reaching us even now as we drift toward sleep. To listen to his life is to be reminded that we too may live with eyes open, that we too may marvel at what others overlook, that we too may leave behind not perfection but wonder. Rest with this final reassurance: you are enough, as he was enough, even in his incompleteness. You are part of the same river, the same sky, the same unfolding of detail. As you close your eyes, let the story of Leonardo da Vinci settle over you like a blanket, soft and unhurried. Let it remind you that life itself is art, unfinished yet beautiful, fleeting yet eternal. Sleep now, gently, and if you wake in the night, remember the boy with charcoal-stained hands watching the birds, the man with candlelit sketches whispering of possibilities, the legacy of wonder that has carried across time to meet you here and now. Softly, we end not with a sharp stop, but with a tapering into silence, like the last brush stroke fading into the canvas, like the last note dissolving into still air. Leonardo's story continues wherever curiosity lives, including in you. Sleep well, and let the night carry you onward, unhurried, safe, and at peace.